The servants scattered like cockroaches when Duke Lucien Vale entered the throne room, their whispers dying in their throats as his boots echoed against marble stained with generations of blood and ambition. He had just returned from the northern border where 3 rebel lords thought they could carve out independence from Ravengard, and now their heads decorated pikes along the outer walls while their families begged for mercy he would never grant. Power in this kingdom was not inherited through birthright alone, but seized through ruthlessness. And Lucien had learned that lesson in ways that carved themselves into his bones. Today, however, the monster they feared would face a different kind of battle, one that began with a contract signed in desperation and ended with a woman he never asked for standing in his fortress. What unfolds next will strip away every mask, every carefully constructed wall, until nothing remains but raw truth and consequences. Stay until the end, because what starts as a transaction will become something far more dangerous. The marriage contract arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a merchant so terrified his hand shook as he placed the sealed envelope on Lucien's desk. The Duke did not look up from the military report spread before him, casualty numbers from the border skirmish that still required his attention, even as nobles played their petty games of survival and ambition. His steward Marcus, a man whose loyalty had been purchased with blood rather than gold, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the Arden family has accepted your terms." Lucien's pen stopped mid-stroke. He had almost forgotten about that particular arrangement, a minor negotiation proposed by his council 3 months ago when they insisted he needed a wife to stabilize his political position. The Arden family was bankrupt, drowning in debts accumulated through gambling and poor investments, and their daughter was the only asset they had left to trade. It was a transaction, nothing more. He would clear their debts. They would provide him with a duchess to appease the traditionalists at court, and everyone would continue playing their roles in this elaborate theater of power. "When does she arrive?" Lucien asked, his voice flat. 3 days, Your Grace. The family has already departed from the southern provinces." Lucien nodded once and returned to his reports. The woman was irrelevant. She would occupy the east wing of Ravengard Manor, attend the necessary social functions, and otherwise stay out of his way. He had no interest in companionship or the pretense of affection. His world was built on control and fear, and introducing sentiment into that equation was a weakness he could not afford. Marcus hesitated at the door. "Your Grace, there is one other matter. Lord Arden has requested an audience upon his arrival. He wishes to discuss additional financial arrangements." Something cold flickered through Lucien's chest. Additional arrangements. The man was already attempting to renegotiate terms before his daughter had even crossed the threshold. It was typical of the desperate, always grasping for more, even as they sank deeper into the mire of their own making. "He will receive no audience," Lucien said quietly. "The contract is final. If he attempts to approach me with further requests, inform him that I will reconsider the marriage entirely and let his family collapse into ruin." Marcus bowed and disappeared, leaving Lucien alone with his thoughts, and the gnawing sensation that this arrangement would become far more complicated than he had anticipated. Lady Seraphina Arden had been raised on stories about Duke Lucien Vale, though none of them resembled anything close to a fairy tale. The Northern Duke was a legend wrapped in horror, a man who crushed rebellions with such brutal efficiency that even the king hesitated to cross him. She had heard about the executions, the political purges, the way entire families disappeared when they opposed him. Now she was going to marry this monster, and her father assured her it was an honor. The carriage rattled along the northern road, each mile bringing her closer to Ravengard and further from everything she had ever known. Her father sat across from her, his face flushed with wine and relief. He had been drinking since they left the estate, celebrating what he called their salvation. "You should be grateful, Seraphina," Lord Arden said, his words slightly slurred. "The Duke is powerful beyond measure. You will want for nothing." Seraphina stared out the window at the barren landscape, rolling hills that gradually gave way to darker forests and rocky terrain. She wanted to ask why the Duke had chosen their family, why he would marry someone from a bankrupt house when he could have any noblewoman in the kingdom. But she already knew the answer. He chose them because they were desperate enough to agree without asking questions, because her father would sign anything to escape his debts. "What is he like?" she asked quietly. Her father waved a dismissive hand. "What does it matter? He is a duke. He has wealth and power. That is all you need to concern yourself with. But what if— Enough. Lord Arden's voice turned sharp. You will do your duty, Serafina. You will marry him. You will produce heirs if required. And you will not embarrass this family with your nervous questions. We have sacrificed everything to secure this arrangement. Sacrificed. The word settled in her stomach like a stone. Her father spoke as if he were the one being sold, as if this marriage was his burden to bear rather than hers. Serafina turned back to the window, blinking away the tears that threatened to fall. She had been taught her entire life that her value was tied to her ability to secure an advantageous marriage, but she never imagined it would feel so much like being livestock at auction. Her mother would have understood. Her mother would have held her and told her that sometimes survival required compromise, that women of their class had been making these bargains for centuries. But her mother had died 2 years ago, leaving Serafina alone with a father who saw her only as currency. The forest grew denser as they traveled north, the trees pressing close to the road like spectators at an execution. Serafina tried to imagine what her life would look like in Ravengard Manor, tried to picture herself as a duchess, but the images would not form. All she could see was darkness and stone, a fortress where she would disappear into obscurity while her husband waged his wars and played his political games. When they finally crested the hill and Ravengard Manor came into view, Serafina's breath caught in her throat. It was not a manor at all, but a castle, a massive structure of black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. Towers jutted into the gray sky, and massive walls surrounded the estate like a prison. This was not a home. This was a monument to power and domination. Magnificent, her father breathed, leaning forward to get a better view. Serafina said nothing. She was staring at the walls and wondering if she would ever leave them again. Mats. Lucien was in the training yard when the Arden family arrived, his sword cutting through the afternoon air as he worked through combat drills with a ferocity that made the watching guards step back. He had learned early that physical exertion was the only reliable way to silence the chaos in his mind, the constant calculations and strategies that threatened to consume him if left unchecked. He sensed Marcus approaching before the steward spoke, the man's cautious footsteps, a familiar rhythm. Your Grace, the Arden family has entered the gates. Lucien drove his sword into the training dummy with enough force to split the wood, then pulled it free and handed the weapon to a nearby guard. He did not bother changing from his training clothes, the simple black shirt and pants already soaked with sweat. Let them see him as he was. Let the woman understand immediately what kind of man she had married. The entrance hall was designed to intimidate, with its vaulted ceilings and cold stone walls decorated with the shields and weapons of conquered enemies. Lucien had staged countless negotiations and confrontations in this space, watching nobles and diplomats shrink under the weight of Ravengard's history. He took his position at the top of the grand staircase, looking down as the servants ushered in the Arden family. Lord Arden entered first, his expensive clothes unable to hide the desperation that clung to him like cheap perfume. He bowed deeply, perhaps too deeply, the gesture of a man trying to compensate for his weakness with exaggerated deference. Your Grace, we are honored. Save it, Lucien interrupted, his voice echoing through the hall. The contract has been signed. There is no need for pleasantries. Lord Arden's face flushed, but he nodded and stepped aside, revealing the figure behind him. Lady Serafina Arden was not what Lucien expected. He had anticipated someone older, hardened by the realities of their fallen status. Instead, he found himself looking at a young woman who stared up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance that immediately complicated his carefully maintained indifference. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, modest but well-made, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her eyes. She was terrified. He could see it in the slight tremor of her hands, the way she held herself perfectly still, as if any movement might trigger disaster. But beneath the fear was something else, a core of steel that refused to bend even as she stood in the hall of the monster she had been sold to. Lucien descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, watching as Serafina's composure wavered but did not break. When he reached the bottom, he stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. You understand the terms of this arrangement? He asked. Serafina's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. I understand that I am to be your wife. You are to be my duchess, Lucien corrected. There is a difference. You will attend court functions, manage the household staff, and maintain the appearance of a proper marriage. Beyond that, you will have your freedom within these walls. You will not be bothered. He saw confusion flicker across her face, quickly replaced by something that might have been relief. She had expected worse. Most women in her position would have. I understand, Your Grace, she said quietly. Lord Arden stepped forward, his merchant smile plastered across his face. Your Grace, if I might have a moment to discuss— No! Lucien did not look at the man, his attention still fixed on Serafina. You will leave Ravengard tonight. Your business here is concluded. But, Your Grace, there are matters we should discuss, additional considerations that could benefit both our families. Lucien finally turned to face Lord Arden, and whatever the man saw in his expression made him stumble backward. You sold your daughter to clear your debts. The transaction is complete. If you attempt to extract anything more from this arrangement, I will personally ensure that every remaining asset your family possesses is seized and you spend the rest of your miserable life in a debtor's prison. Am I understood? The color drained from Lord Arden's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded once before practically fleeing toward the exit. Lucien watched him go with cold satisfaction. Men like Arden were parasites, always taking, always consuming, until someone cut them off at the source. When he turned back to Serafina, he found her staring at the door her father had disappeared through, her expression unreadable. For a moment he wondered if she would cry, if the reality of her situation would finally break through her careful composure, but she simply took a deep breath and faced him again. May I see my quarters, Your Grace? Lucien gestured to a waiting servant. Mrs. Brennan will show you to the East Wing. You will find everything you need there. The wedding will take place in 3 days. Until then, consider yourself free to explore the manor. He did not wait for her response, turning and walking away before the strange sensation in his chest could develop into anything resembling concern. This was a transaction, he reminded himself. Nothing more. The East Wing of Ravengard Manor was beautiful in a cold, untouchable way, like a museum dedicated to a life Serafina would never truly inhabit. Her chambers consisted of a massive bedroom, a private sitting room, and a study filled with books she suspected no one had read in decades. Everything was perfectly maintained, expensive and elegant, and utterly devoid of warmth. Mrs. Brennan, the head housekeeper, was a severe woman in her 50s who explained the household routines with military precision. Breakfast was served at 7, dinner at 8. The Duke rarely dined with others but expected his household to maintain strict schedules. Serafina was free to request anything she needed, but she should not expect to see her husband outside of official functions. The Duke values his privacy, Mrs. Brennan said, her tone suggesting this was both an explanation and a warning. He will not interfere with your life if you do not interfere with his. After the housekeeper left, Serafina stood in the center of her new bedroom and tried to process the reality of her situation. She had expected cruelty, perhaps violence, the casual brutality that powerful men often inflicted on women they saw as property. Instead, she found indifference, which somehow felt worse. She was not even important enough to mistreat. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds of Ravengard. The castle sat atop a hill, surrounded by forests that stretched to the horizon. It was isolated, cut off from civilization in a way that made her feel like she had been exiled rather than elevated. Somewhere beyond those trees was her family's estate, her old life, everything she had lost. But she could not mourn it, because there was nothing there worth mourning. Her father had made that clear when he sold her without a second thought. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A young maid entered, carrying a tray with tea and small cakes. "Compliments of His Grace," the girl said quietly, setting the tray on a side table. "He thought you might be hungry after your journey." Serafina stared at the tea, the small gesture that contradicted everything she knew about the Duke. It was thoughtful in a mechanical way, the kind of consideration someone showed when they were following protocol rather than genuine concern. But it was something. "Thank you," she said. The maid curtsied and left, and Serafina poured herself a cup of tea with trembling hands. She was trapped in a fortress with a man who terrified his own kingdom, about to marry him in a ceremony that would seal her fate permanently. And yet, as she sipped the tea and felt its warmth spread through her chest, She found herself thinking about the way the Duke had dismissed her father, the cold fury in his voice when Lord Arden tried to negotiate for more. He had protected her in that moment, even if he did not realize it. He had drawn a line that her father could not cross. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. It was something else entirely, and Serafina did not yet have the words to describe it. But Lucien did not see Serafina again until the wedding ceremony 3 days later. He spent the intervening time dealing with reports from his border commanders and meeting with his council of advisors, men who served him out of fear and self-interest rather than loyalty. The wedding was a political necessity, a show of stability meant to reassure the kingdom that Ravengard remained strong and legitimate. The actual woman involved was irrelevant to those calculations. Or so he told himself. But late at night, when sleep eluded him and he walked the empty halls of his castle, he found his thoughts drifting to the young woman in the East Wing. He wondered what she thought of Ravengard, whether she was crying herself to sleep or plotting her escape. He wondered why her father's desperation bothered him so much, why the memory of her steady voice saying "I understand" kept replaying in his mind. He had built his entire life on emotional distance, on the understanding that attachment was weakness, and sentiment was a luxury for people who could afford it. He had watched his own father rule through intimidation and violence, had learned that power required sacrifice, including the sacrifice of everything soft and human inside himself. And it had worked. He had transformed Ravengard from a minor northern duchy into a force that even the king respected and feared. But something about Serafina's arrival had destabilized the careful architecture of his detachment, and Lucien did not know how to rebuild it. The wedding took place in the castle's great hall, witnessed by a carefully selected group of nobles and officials who needed to see the Duke take a wife. Serafina wore a dress of white silk, simple but elegant, and she walked down the aisle alone since her father had departed as ordered. Lucien watched her approach and saw the fear she was trying so hard to hide, the way her hands clenched the bouquet of winter roses someone had provided. The ceremony was brief, the traditional vows spoken by a priest who rushed through the words as if afraid to linger too long in Lucien's presence. When the time came to seal the marriage with a kiss, Lucien leaned down and pressed his lips to Serafina's forehead instead, a chaste gesture that surprised her and sent whispers through the assembled witnesses. "You are my Duchess now," he murmured, too quiet for others to hear. "No one will harm you while you bear that title." He did not know why he said it. The words emerged before he could stop them, a promise he had no business making. But Serafina looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and he saw something shift in her expression, a fragment of understanding that passed between them like a secret. The reception that followed was torture. Lucien endured the congratulations of nobles who hated him, the false smiles and carefully worded compliments that masked contempt and jealousy. Serafina played her role perfectly, thanking guests with gracious words while maintaining the reserved distance appropriate for a new duchess. She did not cling to him or seek his protection, did not perform the helpless bride act that many women in her position would have adopted. She simply existed beside him, a separate entity bound by circumstance rather than choice. When the last guest finally departed and they were alone in the great hall, Lucien turned to her. "You did well today," he said. Serafina met his gaze directly. "I understand what is expected of me, Your Grace." "Lucien," he corrected, "you are my wife. You may use my name when we are alone." She nodded slowly, and he saw her testing the name silently, as if trying to determine whether it was a trap. "I will return to my duties tomorrow," Lucien continued. "You should spend time familiarizing yourself with the household and the estate. If you need anything, inform Mrs. Brennan." He started to leave, to retreat to his study where he could analyze reports and forget about the strange ache in his chest. But Serafina's voice stopped him. "May I ask you something?" Lucien turned back, wary. "What?" "Why did you agree to this marriage? You could have chosen anyone." "Why my family?" It was a dangerous question, one that touched on motivations he had not fully examined himself. He should have dismissed her, should have maintained the wall between them. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "Because you needed a way out, and I needed a wife who would not expect love. It was a practical arrangement." Serafina's expression flickered with something that might have been pain or resignation. "I see. Thank you for your honesty." She left before he could respond, her white dress disappearing up the stairs like a ghost. Lucian stood in the empty hall and wondered when exactly this transaction had started to feel like something more. The first month of marriage passed in a strange state of coexistence. Serafina established routines, managing the household with quiet efficiency and reading through the extensive library in her study. Lucien buried himself in work, spending long hours in meetings with his military commanders and council members. They saw each other at dinners, formal affairs where conversation remained superficial and safe, but otherwise maintained their separate lives within the castle's walls. It should have been sustainable. It should have been exactly what Lucien wanted. But then, reports started arriving about Lord Arden's activities in the capital. The man had not learned his lesson. Instead of disappearing into obscurity, he was spreading rumors about his daughter's marriage, positioning himself as an intimate advisor to the Duke, and attempting to secure business deals based on that false connection. Worse, he had begun quietly approaching other nobles, suggesting that Serafina could be useful in influencing her husband's decisions. Lucien read the intelligence reports with growing fury. Lord Arden was trying to use his daughter as a tool even after selling her, attempting to profit from the marriage by positioning her as an access point to Ravengard's power. It was brazen manipulation, the kind of opportunistic parasitism that made Lucien's blood burn with rage. He found Serafina in the library that evening, curled in a chair by the fireplace with a book of poetry. She looked up when he entered, and her expression immediately shifted to concern. "What has happened?" she asked quietly. Lucien handed her the report. "Your father is attempting to use you to gain political influence." He watched her face as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks, and her hands begin to shake. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully and stared into the fire. "I did not know," she whispered. "I thought the marriage would be the end of it. I thought he would leave me alone." "Did you know he was selling you?" Lucien asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Did you understand that he was profiting from this arrangement beyond the debt clearance?" Serafina looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes now, tears she furiously blinked away. "What are you implying?" "I'm asking if you were complicit in his schemes, if you entered this marriage intending to manipulate me for your family's benefit." The words were cruel, and he knew it even as they left his mouth. But he needed to know, needed to understand if the woman he had begun to trust was just another player in the endless game of deception that defined his world. Serafina stood slowly, her book falling to the floor. "You believe I am here to spy on you, to undermine you for my father's sake?" "I believe," Lucien said coldly, "that people rarely act without self-interest. Your father is attempting to leverage your position. I need to know if you are part of that plan." The slap came so fast he barely registered it before the sting spread across his cheek. Serafina stood before him, trembling with rage, her hand still raised. "How dare you?" she breathed. "How dare you accuse me of being his accomplice when you saw how he treated me? I was merchandise to him, a thing to be sold when he ran out of options. I did not know about any additional arrangements. I did not know he was spreading rumors or attempting to use me. I have been nothing but honest with you since I arrived in this godforsaken fortress." Lucien stared at her, at the fury and pain radiating from her like heat from a flame. She was magnificent in her anger. All pretense of the obedient duchess burned away to reveal something raw and real beneath. "You think I wanted this?" Serafina continued, her voice breaking. "You think I chose to marry a man feared by an entire kingdom? I came here because I had no choice, because my father destroyed everything and I was the only currency he had left. And now you accuse me of conspiring with him when all I have done is try to survive in a place where I do not belong." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucien could feel his carefully constructed walls crumbling, could feel something shifting in his chest that he did not know how to name or control. "I believe you," he said finally, the words rough. Serafina's anger seemed to collapse inward, leaving only exhaustion. "Do you? Or will you always wonder if I am playing some elaborate game?" Lucien took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the unshed tears clinging to her lashes. "I will handle your father. He will not use you again." "And what does that mean?" Serafina asked. "Will you have him killed? Imprisoned? I will destroy his reputation so thoroughly that no one in this kingdom will ever trust him again. He will become untouchable, toxic to anyone who might consider doing business with him. And if he attempts to contact you or spread further lies, then yes, I will consider more permanent solutions. He expected her to recoil, to be horrified by his ruthlessness. Instead, Serafina simply nodded. Good, she said quietly. He deserves that and worse for what he has done. Lucienne reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The gesture felt foreign, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with their forced marriage and everything to do with the strange connection forming between them despite every logical reason it should not exist. You are not alone here anymore, he said. You have my protection, truly. Serafina closed her eyes, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch, before stepping back. I should retire. Thank you for telling me about my father. She left quickly, and Lucien stood in the library surrounded by books and firelight, his hand still tingling from where he had touched her face. Something fundamental had shifted between them tonight. Some line had been crossed that he could not uncross. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, all he felt was a fierce determination to protect the woman he had married from everyone who had ever tried to use her, including, perhaps especially, her own family. But as he walked through the dark halls of Ravengard toward his study, Lucien did not know that Lord Arden's manipulation was only the beginning, that forces far more dangerous than a desperate nobleman were already moving against them, and that the choice to truly protect Serafina would cost him everything he had built in ways he could not yet imagine. The game had changed, and neither of them were prepared for what came next. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of dawn that made Ravengard feel even more like a prison than usual. Lucien stood at the window of his study, watching frost patterns form on the glass while his mind worked through the problem of Lord Arden with methodical precision. The man had made himself a target, and targets in Lucien's world did not remain standing for long. He had learned early that mercy was not kindness but weakness disguised as virtue, and weakness invited exploitation. His father had taught him that lesson with fists and fire, breaking him down until only the essential parts remained, the parts that could survive in a world built on domination and fear. Some men were born into power. Others had it carved into their bones through pain until they understood that control was the only currency that mattered. That sentiment was a luxury reserved for people who could afford to be destroyed. But something had shifted last night when Serafina slapped him, when she stood trembling with rage and told him exactly what she thought of his accusations. He had seen something in her that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, that same core of steel wrapped in vulnerability, that same desperate need to survive in a world designed to consume people like them. Marcus entered without knocking, a privilege earned through decades of service and discretion. The steward carried a leather folder thick with documents. The information you requested about Lord Arden, Marcus said, placing the folder on Lucien's desk. His debts were more extensive than we initially understood. The marriage settlement cleared the primary obligations, but he has since accumulated new gambling losses. He owes money to 3 different merchant houses and at least 2 minor nobles. Lucien opened the folder and scanned the financial records, his expression darkening with each page. Lord Arden had not just attempted to leverage his daughter's position for influence. He had been actively using the Vale name to secure loans he had no intention or ability to repay, telling creditors that his connection to the Duke guaranteed his solvency. The merchant houses are demanding payment, Marcus continued. When Arden could not deliver, he promised them access to Ravengard's trade routes and suggested that his daughter could convince you to grant them favorable contracts. The rage that surged through Lucien was cold and calculating rather than hot and reckless. This was not just opportunism. This was systematic exploitation, a deliberate campaign to turn Serafina into a tool for Lord Arden's continued parasitism. The man had sold her once and was now attempting to rent her out piece by piece to anyone willing to pay for the illusion of ducal favor. I want a full accounting of every deal he has made using my name or my wife's position, Lucien said quietly. Every promise, every contract, every handshake agreement. And then I want letters sent to every creditor and business associate explaining that Lord Arden has no authority to negotiate on behalf of Ravengard, and that any agreements made under that pretense are void. Marcus nodded. That will destroy him financially. No one will extend him credit again. Good. I want him broken. I want him so thoroughly ruined that the mere mention of his name becomes synonymous with fraud and desperation. And if he retaliates, if he attempts to spread more damaging rumors about the Duchess, Lucien's voice dropped to something dangerous. Then we move to permanent solutions. But give him the chance to disappear quietly first. Some men understand when they have lost. If he is not one of them, we will make him understand. After Marcus left, Lucien sat with the documents spread before him and tried to reconcile the fury burning in his chest with the cold pragmatism that had always guided his decisions. He had crushed rebellions and eliminated political enemies without hesitation, viewing them as necessary casualties in the maintenance of his power. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the woman sleeping in the East Wing who deserved better than being used as currency by the man who should have protected her. The realization settled over him like armor, heavy and inevitable. He had married Serafina as a transaction, but somewhere in the past month she had become something else. Something he did not have words for but recognized in the way his thoughts kept returning to her, in the way her tears last night had felt like physical wounds in his own chest. He was beginning to care about her, and in his world, caring was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Jungkook. Serafina spent the morning in the castle's greenhouse, a glass structure attached to the south wall where exotic plants somehow thrived despite the northern climate. Mrs. Brennan had mentioned it in passing during one of their household meetings, and Serafina had been drawn to it immediately, seeking refuge in the green living things that did not judge or fear her. She knelt beside a bed of winter roses, their white petals edged with frost, and tried not to think about the previous night. She had slapped the Duke. She had called his fortress God-forsaken. She had shown him exactly how much anger she carried beneath her carefully maintained composure, and now she waited for consequences that felt inevitable. But there had been something else in that confrontation, something in the way Lucien had looked at her after the initial shock faded. He had believed her. More than that, he had promised to protect her from her father, and the promise had not sounded empty or performative. It had sounded like a vow. "You should not be kneeling in the dirt, Your Grace. It is not fitting for a duchess." Serafina looked up to find an older woman watching her from the greenhouse entrance, her expression disapproving. She wore the expensive clothes of minor nobility, though the fabric was slightly outdated in style. "I am sorry," Serafina said, rising and brushing soil from her dress. "I did not realize there were rules about gardening." The woman's lips thinned. "There are rules about everything when you hold a title, but then I suppose you would not know that, coming from such a fallen house." The words were carefully calculated to wound, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that wealthy people often mistook for honesty. Serafina felt her spine straighten, felt the anger from last night stirring again. "And you are?" she asked coolly. "Lady Margot Blackwood. My late husband was a cousin to the Duke. I have resided at Ravengard for the past 5 years, managing the household affairs before your arrival." Before your arrival. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Serafina suddenly understood that she was not the only person whose life had been disrupted by this marriage, that there were people at Ravengard who resented her presence and saw her as an interloper. "Mrs. Brennan manages the household now," Serafina said carefully. "But I appreciate all that you have done." Lady Margot's smile was sharp. "Mrs. Brennan follows orders. I provided actual guidance. But the Duke decided to replace experience with a child who knows nothing of managing an estate of this importance." Serafina felt her temper rising but forced herself to remain calm. This was a test, she realized. Lady Margot was probing for weakness, trying to determine if the new Duchess could be intimidated or manipulated. "I am learning," Serafina said, "and I imagine the Duke makes his decisions based on what serves Ravengard best, not on what makes individuals comfortable. Indeed, the Duke is very good at making ruthless decisions. I wonder if you understand just how ruthless he can be, my dear. You seem like a gentle creature. This world will eat you alive." Before Serafina could respond, Lucien's voice cut through the greenhouse like a blade. "Lady Margot, I was not aware you were speaking with my wife." Both women turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his presence filling the space with immediate tension. Lady Margot's confidence faltered, her smile becoming strained. "Your Grace, I was simply welcoming the Duchess to one of Ravengard's treasures. The greenhouse has been my personal project for years. It is part of the estate, not your personal domain," Lucian said quietly, "and my wife does not require your guidance or your assessment of her capabilities. If she wishes to garden in dirt or dance on the tables, that is her prerogative as Duchess of Ravengard." Lady Margot's face flushed with humiliation and rage. "I meant no offense, Your Grace. I was merely trying to help. Your help is not required. You may leave." It was a dismissal so absolute that even Lady Margot understood there was no room for negotiation. She curtsied stiffly and swept from the greenhouse, her expensive skirts rustling with indignation. Serafina waited until they were alone before speaking. "You did not need to do that. I could have handled her." "I know you could have," Lucian said, moving closer to examine the winter roses she had been tending. "But you should not have to. Lady Margot has been a fixture at Ravengard for years, and she has grown comfortable with the influence she wielded in my household. Your arrival threatened that comfort, and she will continue to test you unless boundaries are established clearly." He looked at her directly, and Serafina saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You are my wife. That means you have my full support and authority. Anyone who undermines you undermines me, and I will not tolerate it." The words should have felt like another transaction, another political calculation, but the way he said them, the intensity in his gaze, suggested something deeper running beneath the surface. "Thank you," Serafina said quietly, "for last night as well, for believing me about my father." Lucien's jaw tightened. "I have information about his activities. The situation is worse than I initially realized. He has been using your position to secure fraudulent business deals and accumulate new debts. I am taking steps to destroy his credibility and cut off all his remaining financial resources." Serafina absorbed this information with a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Her father had not changed. He had simply found new ways to exploit the daughter he had already sold. "Will it be enough?" she asked. "Or will he keep trying?" "If he keeps trying, I will escalate the consequences until he stops permanently." The implication was clear. Lucienne was offering to kill her father if necessary, to eliminate the threat he posed with the same cold efficiency he applied to all his enemies. Serafina knew she should be horrified. Instead, she felt only a grim acceptance. "I do not want him dead," she said carefully. "But I do not want him in my life either. Whatever you decide to do, I will not interfere." Lucienne stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cool greenhouse air. "You should not have to make these choices. You should not have been put in this position." "Neither should you," Serafina said. "You married me as a political arrangement, and now you are dealing with my family's disasters." "The arrangement changed," Lucian said quietly. "I'm not certain when, but it did." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them seemed ready to fully examine. Serafina found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the intensity of his presence and the strange safety she felt despite knowing exactly how dangerous he was. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we adapt," Lucian said. "We acknowledge that this marriage has become more complicated than either of us intended, and we decide what we want it to be going forward." Before Serafina could respond, Marcus appeared at the greenhouse entrance, his expression urgent. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. Lord Arden has arrived at the castle gates demanding an audience." Lucien's expression went cold and flat, all the warmth from moments ago disappearing like it had never existed. "He was warned to stay away. He claims he has critical information about threats to the Duchess. He says if you do not grant him an audience, you will regret it." Serafina felt ice flood her veins. Her father was here, attempting to manipulate his way back into their lives with threats disguised as warnings. She looked at Lucian and saw something terrifying in his eyes, a fury so controlled it had become lethal. "Let him in," Lucian said softly, "but have guards ready. If he makes one wrong move, one attempt to threaten or intimidate my wife, I want him restrained immediately." The Great Hall felt different when filled with hostility rather than ceremony. Lord Arden stood in the center of the room, flanked by two of Lucian's guards. His expensive clothes rumpled from travel and his face flushed with desperation and alcohol. Serafina stood beside Lucian at the top of the stairs, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture that felt both possessive and protective. "Lord Arden," Lucian said, his voice echoing through the hall. You were instructed not to return to Ravengard. You were warned that further contact would have consequences. Your Grace, please, you must listen, Lord Arden said, his words tumbling over each other. I have information. There are nobles plotting against you, using my daughter as leverage. They believe they can manipulate her, turn her against you. I came to warn you before it is too late. It was a desperate gambit, a last attempt to make himself useful by creating threats that did not exist. Serafina felt disgust rise in her throat. What nobles? Lucian asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. I cannot reveal their names without assurances of my safety and compensation for the risks I am taking. But I swear to you, Your Grace, the danger is real. Serafina is in terrible danger, and only I can help protect her. Lucian descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, and Serafina followed because staying at his side felt more important than maintaining the proper distance. When they reached the bottom, Lucien stopped directly in front of Lord Arden. You are lying, Lucien said quietly. There are no plots. There are no threats. There is only you, attempting to leverage your daughter one more time because you have run out of other options. Lord Arden's face went white, then red. How dare you call me a liar? I am her father. I am trying to protect her from your brutality. You sold her to clear your gambling debts, Lucien said, his voice rising. You then used her name and position to secure fraudulent business deals. You spread rumors positioning yourself as an influential advisor to my household. You turned your own daughter into a commodity and continue to exploit her even after I paid for your mistakes. That is not true. Serafina, tell him. Tell him how I have always provided for you, how I sacrificed everything to secure your future. Serafina stepped forward, and every eye in the room focused on her. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way this confrontation would define not just her relationship with her father, but her entire position at Ravengard. You provided nothing, she said, her voice steady despite the rage and pain churning inside her. Mother provided. Mother protected me and managed the estate while you gambled away our fortune. And when she died, you waited exactly 6 months before selling me to the first bidder who could solve your financial problems. Lord Arden's expression twisted with fury. You ungrateful wretch! I gave you life. I gave you everything. You gave me away, Serafina said. There is a difference. Lucien's hand moved to the small of her back. A touch so subtle most people would miss it, but solid enough that she could feel his support grounding her. This audience is over, Lucien. Lucien said, You will leave Ravengard now, and you will never contact my wife again. If you spread any rumors, if you use her name in any capacity, if you so much as mention this family in conversation, I will destroy you so completely that you will wish I had simply killed you instead. Lord Arden seemed to realize that he had lost, that his last desperate play had failed. His shoulders slumped, and when he looked at Serafina, she saw something that might have been regret or might have been rage at losing his final bargaining chip. You will regret this, Lord Arden said quietly. Both of you. You think you are so powerful, but power makes enemies. And when they come for you, do not expect any mercy. The guards moved forward to escort him out, but Lord Arden shook them off and walked toward the exit under his own power, his dignity in tatters. At the doorway, he turned back one last time. I hope he is worth it, Serafina. I hope you understand what you have chosen. Then he was gone, and the great hall fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the sound of Serafina's ragged breathing. She felt Lucien's arm come around her waist, steadying her as the adrenaline drained away and left her shaking. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Serafina nodded, not trusting her voice. She had just permanently severed her relationship with her father, had chosen the husband she barely knew over the man who raised her. It should have felt wrong. Instead, it felt like freedom. He will cause more trouble, she said finally. His pride will not allow him to simply disappear. I know, but we will handle it together. The word together resonated through Serafina with unexpected force. She looked up at Lucien and saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten, a fierce protectiveness mixed with something softer that he seemed almost afraid to acknowledge. Why are you doing this? She asked. Why does my father's behavior matter so much to you? Lucien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to determine how much truth she could handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. Because you are mine now. and I protect what is mine. The possessiveness in his words should have been frightening. In anyone else's mouth, it would have been another form of ownership, another way of turning her into property. But from Lucian, it felt different. It felt like a vow, like he was wrapping her in the same absolute protection he extended to his lands and his power, like she had become part of the fortress he had built around his life. Serafina realized with sudden clarity that she had stopped being afraid of him. Somewhere between the wedding and now, fear had transformed into something else entirely, something dangerous and consuming that she did not yet have the courage to name. "We should return to our duties," Lucien said, releasing her and stepping back. "The council meets this afternoon, and there are reports I need to review." But he hesitated, his hand rising as if to touch her face before falling back to his side. Serafina saw the war happening behind his eyes, the way he was fighting against whatever was building between them, even as he surrendered to it piece by piece. "Tonight," she said impulsively, "have dinner with me. Not in the formal dining room. In my chambers or yours. Just the two of us." Lucian's expression flickered with something that might have been longing or fear. "That would not be appropriate." "We are married. How can it be inappropriate?" "Because it crosses a line we agreed would not be crossed. Because it changes this arrangement into something else." "Maybe it has already changed," Serafina said, echoing his words from the greenhouse. "Maybe we need to stop pretending it has not." She did not wait for his response, turning and walking away before the tears threatening to spill could betray how much his hesitation hurt. She had been brave in front of her father, had stood her ground and chosen Lucien over family loyalty. But now she needed to be brave in a different way, needed to admit that she was falling for the cold duke who terrified his enemies and somehow made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. Lucien stood alone in the great hall and tried to remember why emotional distance was necessary, why caring about Serafina was a weakness he could not afford. But all he could think about was the way she had looked standing beside him while confronting her father, the strength in her voice when she told Lord Arden exactly what he was, the trust in her eyes when she asked him to have dinner in her chambers. She was offering him something real, something beyond the political transaction they had both agreed to. And he wanted it with an intensity that terrified him, because wanting things, truly wanting them, gave them the power to destroy you. His father had taught him that lesson young. Love was leverage. Attachment was vulnerability. The only way to survive in a world built on power was to care about nothing and no one more than you cared about control. But Serafina made him question every lesson, every carefully constructed defense. She made him wonder if maybe survival was not the same as living, if maybe the fortress he had built was also a prison, if maybe the coldness he wore like armor was actually just another form of cowardice. Marcus appeared from the shadows where he had been observing. "The council is waiting, Your Grace." "Tell them I will be delayed." "And the Duchess? What should I tell her about tonight?" Lucian closed his eyes and felt the last of his resistance crumble. "Tell her I will dine with her, in her chambers, at 8. He could feel Marcus's surprise even without looking at the steward's face. In all the years they had worked together, Lucien had never made a decision based on personal feelings rather than strategic calculation. This was new territory, dangerous and uncharted. "Shall I have Lady Margot arrange the details?" Marcus asked carefully. "No, Mrs. Brennan will handle it. I want Lady Margot out of Ravengard by the end of the week. Find her suitable accommodations in the capital and a modest pension. She has served adequately, but her time here is finished." Another decision made not for political reasons, but because he could not stand the thought of anyone undermining Serafina or making her feel unwelcome in what should be her home. Marcus bowed and left, and Lucien forced himself to walk toward the council chambers where his advisors waited to discuss military movements and trade agreements and all the mundane business of maintaining power. But his thoughts kept returning to the dinner tonight, to the choice he was making to let Serafina pass the walls he had spent a lifetime building. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was everything he had sworn never to do, and he could not wait. The knock came at 8 exactly. Serafina had spent the afternoon alternating between excitement and dread, unsure if Lucien would actually come or if he would send a polite excuse through a servant. She had changed dresses 3 times before settling on a simple gown of deep green that Mrs. Brennan assured her was appropriate for a private dinner without being overly formal. When she opened the door, Lucien stood in the hallway looking as uncomfortable as she felt. He had changed from his usual severe black into dark gray, his hair still damp from bathing, and for a moment they simply stared at each other like strangers. "Come in," Serafina said finally, stepping aside. Her sitting room had been transformed by the servants into an intimate dining space, with a small table near the fireplace set for two. Candles provided soft light, and someone had brought up wine from the castle cellars. It looked romantic in a way that made Serafina's heart race with nervous anticipation. "This is nice," Lucien said awkwardly, and Serafina had to suppress a smile at how completely out of his element he seemed. They sat, and servants appeared to serve the first course before disappearing again, leaving them alone with their tension and unspoken questions. Serafina took a sip of wine for courage and then decided that if they were going to do this, they should do it honestly. "Tell me about your father," she said. Lucien's expression went carefully blank. "Why would you want to know about him?" "Because I told you about mine. Because I want to understand what made you into the man you are." For a long moment she thought he would refuse, would retreat behind the cold mask he wore so well. But then he leaned back in his chair and stared into the fire. "He was brutal," Lucien said quietly. "Everything he did was designed to break me, to strip away anything soft or weak. He believed that power required absolute ruthlessness, that sentiment was a disease that would destroy our family. So he trained me the way you train a weapon, through pain and fear until only the essential parts remained." Serafina felt her throat tighten. "Did your mother not protect you?" "She died when I was 7. After that, there was no one to soften his methods. He owned me completely until the day he died, and even then, his lessons remained." "What lessons?" Lucien met her eyes, and she saw decades of carefully controlled pain in his gaze. That love is weakness, that attachment gives people power over you, that the only way to survive is to care about nothing more than you care about control. "Do you believe that?" Serafina asked. "I believed it for a very long time. I built my entire life around those principles. And it worked. I became powerful. I became feared. I created something no one could touch or destroy." "But?" Serafina prompted gently. "But then you slapped me and called my home God-forsaken, and I realized that maybe surviving is not the same as living. Maybe the fortress I built is also a prison. Maybe my father was wrong about everything except the parts about power mattering." He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his shoulders tense. Serafina rose and moved to stand beside him, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. "I am terrified of you," Lucien said, so quietly she almost missed it. "You have gotten past every defense I spent my life building, and I do not know what to do with that except push you away or pull you closer, and both options feel like surrender." Serafina reached out slowly and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Maybe surrender is not weakness. Maybe it is just another form of strength." Lucien looked down at their joined hands like he was seeing something impossible, something that defied the natural laws of his world. Then he turned to face her fully, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. "If I let myself care about you the way I want to," he said roughly, "I will become something dangerous. I will destroy anyone who threatens you. I will turn this entire kingdom into a war zone to keep you safe. That is what my father's lessons created. A monster who knows only how to protect through domination." "Then dominate," Serafina whispered, "but do it for me instead of against me." The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste gesture from their wedding. It was fierce and desperate, filled with all the longing and fear they had been suppressing for weeks. Serafina felt Lucien's hands tighten in her hair, felt him pull her closer as if he could somehow absorb her into himself where nothing could touch her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Serafina saw something fundamental shift in Lucien's expression. The careful control had shattered, leaving behind raw emotion and a possessiveness so intense it should have been frightening. "You are mine," he said, his voice rough, "completely and absolutely mine. No one will ever use you or hurt you or treat you as less than you are. I will burn this kingdom to ash before I let anyone take you from me." "Yes," Serafina breathed, because it was what she wanted, what she had been craving since the moment he promised to protect her. "Yours." The dinner sat forgotten as they stood wrapped in each other, crossing every line they had drawn, surrendering to something neither of them fully understood but both recognized as inevitable. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled 9 times, marking the hour. Neither of them heard it. They did not know that Lord Arden had already begun spreading vicious rumors in the capital, painting Lucian as a tyrant who had seduced and corrupted his innocent daughter. They did not know that rival nobles were watching Ravengard with calculating eyes, seeing opportunity in the Duke's sudden emotional attachment. They did not know that the political war brewing in the shadows was about to explode into open conflict. All they knew was that something had fundamentally changed between them, that they had crossed a point of no return, and that whatever came next would test everything they had just promised each other in ways neither of them were prepared for. The game had changed, and the consequences were already in motion. The weeks following that dinner passed in a haze of stolen moments and careful discretion. Lucienne and Serafina maintained their public distance during the day, playing their roles as Duke and Duchess with the appropriate formality. But at night, they met in her chambers or his study, talking until dawn about everything and nothing, building something fragile and precious in the spaces between their duties. Lucian found himself changing in ways he did not fully recognize, softening in places he thought had calcified beyond repair. He laughed at Serafina's observations about the ridiculous posturing of court nobles. He brought her books from his private collection and watched her face light up with genuine pleasure. He began to understand that vulnerability was not weakness, but a different kind of courage. That letting someone see the broken parts did not necessarily lead to exploitation. But power always extracts its price, and comfort breeds carelessness. Every fortress has weak points, and the strongest walls often blind their builders to the dangers already inside. The first warning came during a routine council meeting 3 weeks after Lord Arden's expulsion from Ravengard. Marcus entered the chamber with an expression Lucian had learned to recognize as deeply troubling news delivered with professional restraint. Your Grace, Lord Chancellor Rothwick requests a private audience at your earliest convenience. He says it concerns allegations circulating in the capital about the circumstances of your marriage. The council members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between each other with barely concealed interest. Lucien kept his expression neutral, but something cold unfurled in his chest. Rothwick was the king's closest advisor, a political survivor who had outlasted 3 monarchs through careful neutrality and strategic silence. If he was requesting an audience about allegations, it meant the rumors had reached dangerous levels. Clear the room, Lucian said quietly. The council members filed out with varying degrees of reluctance, and Marcus closed the doors behind them. Lucian stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds of Ravengard while his mind worked through possibilities and consequences. What are the specific allegations? He asked. Marcus hesitated, which was never a good sign. Lord Arden has been spreading stories in the capital about your treatment of the Duchess. He claims you coerced him into the marriage through threats and intimidation, that you are holding Lady Serafina prisoner at Ravengard against her will, and that he fears for her safety. Lucian's hands clenched behind his back. He is fabricating a narrative where he is the concerned father rather than the opportunistic parasite who sold his daughter. There is more, Your Grace. Lord Arden has made contact with several noble families who have grievances against you. They are using his allegations to build a case that you are unfit to hold your position, that your methods are too brutal, and your marriage proves you are unstable. Which families? House Blackwood, House Merrick, and House Dalton. All families whose power you have curtailed in the past through military action or economic pressure. Lucian turned from the window, his expression hardening into something sharp and calculating. House Blackwood was expected given Lady Margot's recent removal from Ravengard. The other 2 were opportunistic vultures who saw weakness and gathered to feed, but together they represented significant political influence, enough to cause real problems if they coordinated their efforts. Schedule the meeting with Lord Chancellor Rothwick, Lucian said, and send word to Serafina. She needs to understand what is happening. Marcus nodded and departed, leaving Lucien alone with the gnawing realization that his father's lessons were proving correct in the cruelest possible way. He had allowed himself to care about Serafina, had let her become something more than a political arrangement, and now that attachment was being weaponized against him by people who understood that love was the fastest way to destroy a powerful man. Serafina was in the library when Lucian found her, surrounded by books and looking more at peace than he had ever seen her. The sight made something twist painfully in his chest, because he was about to shatter that peace with consequences neither of them had anticipated. She looked up when he entered and immediately set down her book, her expression shifting to concern. What has happened? Lucian sat beside her and explained the situation with clinical precision, watching her face go pale as she absorbed the implications. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father is trying to destroy you through me, she said finally. He is using my position as a weapon. He is attempting to, yes, but the real danger comes from the noble families supporting him. They see an opportunity to undermine my authority by questioning the legitimacy of our marriage. What can we do? Lucian took her hand, feeling how cold her fingers had become. We present a united front. We show the capital and the court that our marriage is genuine, that you are here by choice, and that your father's allegations are baseless lies from a desperate man. How do we prove that? They will never take my word over his. I am just the daughter he sold, and everyone knows it. Then we change the narrative. We make an appearance at court where you publicly support me and denounce your father's claims. We show them the partnership we have built rather than the transaction that started it. Serafina nodded slowly, but Lucien could see the fear in her eyes, the understanding that they were about to walk into a battle where the weapons were words and perceptions rather than swords and armies. It was the kind of warfare she had not been trained for, and he hated that he was dragging her into it. I am sorry, he said quietly. I should have eliminated your father as a threat when I had the chance. I showed mercy, and now we are both paying the price. No, Serafina said firmly. You showed humanity. You gave him a chance to disappear with dignity. He chose to betray that chance. The fault is his, not yours. She leaned against him, and Lucien wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close while his mind continued working through strategies and contingencies. He would go to the capital with Serafina. They would face Lord Chancellor Rothwick and the court together. And if that was not enough, if the noble families continued to push, then he would resort to the methods he knew best. He would crush them so thoroughly that no one would ever question his authority again. But even as he made these calculations, something whispered that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, that the threat was larger than he understood, that somewhere in the shadows someone was orchestrating events with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of his weaknesses. Ankit. The journey to the capital took 3 days, and Lucien used the time to brief Serafina on court protocol and the political landscape they were entering. She absorbed information quickly, asking sharp questions that revealed how carefully she had been observing since arriving at Ravengard. She understood power dynamics instinctively, could identify alliances and rivalries with minimal explanation. Lucien found himself impressed and more than a little proud of how she had adapted to her role. They arrived at the royal palace late in the afternoon, the massive structure looming over the capital city like a monument to centuries of accumulated authority. The king had granted them chambers in the guest wing, a courtesy that suggested he had not yet taken sides in the brewing conflict but was watching carefully to see how events unfolded. Lord Chancellor Rothwick requested an audience that evening, giving them barely enough time to settle in before the interrogation began. Lucien dressed in his formal attire, the severe black that had become his signature, and waited while Serafina prepared herself. When she emerged from her dressing room, he found himself momentarily speechless. She wore a gown of deep crimson, elegant and expensive, her dark hair styled in an elaborate arrangement that emphasized her youth and beauty. But it was her expression that struck him most, the quiet determination that replaced the uncertainty from days before. She looked every inch a duchess, powerful in her own right rather than simply an extension of his authority. You look formidable, he said. Good. That is what we need right now, is it not? Formidable rather than sympathetic. They walked to Rothwick's offices together, and Lucien felt the weight of eyes watching them from every corridor and doorway. The capital thrived on gossip and intrigue, and their arrival had already become the primary topic of speculation. By tomorrow, every detail of their appearance and behavior would be analyzed and dissected by people looking for confirmation of whatever narrative they had already chosen to believe. Lord Chancellor Rothwick was a thin man in his 60s, his sharp features and calculating eyes giving him the appearance of a predatory bird. He greeted them with formal courtesy that barely masked his skepticism, gesturing for them to sit in the chairs arranged before his massive desk. Your Grace, Lady Serafina, thank you for coming so quickly. I imagine you understand the sensitivity of the situation. I understand that Lord Arden is spreading lies to cover his own failures, Lucian said coldly. I also understand that certain noble families are using those lies to pursue their own agendas against me. Rothwick's expression did not change. Whether the allegations are true or false is not my primary concern. What concerns the king is the stability of the Northern Territories and the perception that you may have overreached your authority. Marriage is a sacred institution, and if there is any suggestion that Lady Seraphina was coerced or is being held against her will, it creates problems that extend beyond your personal affairs.
I was not coerced, Seraphina said quietly, and both men turned to look at her. My father arranged the marriage to clear his debts. That is true, but the Duke did not force or threaten me in any way. He has treated me with more respect and consideration than my own family ever did.
Rothwick leaned back in his chair, studying her with those calculating eyes. And yet, your father claims you are a prisoner at Ravengard, that you are too frightened to speak freely, that the Duke monitors your every move.
My father is a liar and a parasite, Seraphina said, her voice steady but laced with steel.
He sold me to save himself and then attempted to continue profiting from my position by spreading lies about imaginary threats and influence he did not possess. When the Duke cut off those opportunities, he retaliated with these false allegations. Strong words about your own father, my lady. Accurate words. I am here of my own free will, Lord Chancellor. I chose to marry the Duke, and I choose to remain at his side. If anyone is a victim in this situation, it is him, not me. He has done nothing except honor the terms of our agreement and protect me from my father's continued exploitation. Lucian felt something shift in his chest at her words, at the fierce loyalty in her voice as she defended him to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. This was not performance. This was genuine conviction, and it struck him with devastating force how much he had come to depend on having her believe in him. Rothwick was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I will convey your statements to the king. However, the noble families supporting Lord Arden's claims are unlikely to be satisfied with words alone. They will push for a formal investigation, perhaps even a public hearing where evidence and testimony can be examined.
Let them push, Lucius. I have nothing to hide. My marriage is legitimate, and Lady Seraphina can speak for herself. Any investigation will only prove what we have already stated. Perhaps, but investigations have a way of uncovering unexpected complications, Your Grace. I would advise you to prepare for all possibilities.
The warning in Rothwick's tone was clear. He knew something he was not saying directly, some piece of information that would complicate their situation further. Lucien felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in a game where he did not know all the rules, where invisible players moved pieces he could not see. They left Rothwick's office with more questions than answers, and Lucien walked Seraphina back to their chambers in tense silence. Once inside with the doors closed and guards posted, he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. Thank you, he said quietly, for what you said in there. You did not have to defend me so fiercely. Yes, I did, Seraphina said against his chest, because everything I said was true. You are not the monster they want you to be. Lucian wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that he had somehow become something better than the brutal enforcer his father had created. But survival had taught him to trust instincts over hope, and his instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong, that the threat was closer than he realized, that the betrayal when it came would cut deeper than any political maneuvering. He just did not know yet who would wield the knife. The formal court session was scheduled for 2 days later, giving the noble families time to gather their evidence and prepare their accusations. Lucien spent those days meeting with his own allies, calling in favors and reminding people why opposing him was a dangerous proposition. But he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, could sense the careful coalition he had built over years beginning to fracture under pressure. Power in this world was never permanent. It required constant maintenance, constant reminders of why people should fear and respect you. The moment you showed weakness or vulnerability, the vultures descended. Lucien had understood that since childhood, had structured his entire existence around maintaining the appearance of absolute control. But caring about Seraphina had created a crack in that facade, and his enemies were exploiting it with ruthless efficiency. On the morning of the court session, Marcus appeared with news that made Lucian's blood run cold. Your Grace, there has been a development.
Lord Arden has produced documents that he claims prove the marriage was negotiated through blackmail and threats. He says you threatened to seize all his remaining assets and imprison him if he did not agree to your terms.
Lucien felt rage surge through him, hot and consuming. Those are lies. The marriage was a straightforward arrangement. I cleared his debts in exchange for a political alliance. There were no threats. The documents appear authentic, Your Grace. They bear your seal and signature on letters that contain very specific threats about what would happen to the Arden family if they refused the marriage. I never wrote those letters. I never made those threats. Marcus's expression was grim. Then someone forged them, and they did it well enough that Lord Chancellor Rothwick is taking them seriously. Lucian's mind raced through possibilities. Forging documents with his seal required access to his private offices, knowledge of his signature, and the ability to produce materials that would pass expert scrutiny. It was sophisticated work, the kind of operation that required resources and planning far beyond what Lord Arden could manage on his own. Who is helping him? Lucian demanded. Which noble family has the resources to execute this kind of forgery? I do not know yet, Your Grace, but I am investigating. Lucien dismissed Marcus and stood alone in his chambers, feeling the walls closing in. Someone close to him had betrayed him. Someone with access to his seal and signature had manufactured evidence to destroy his reputation and legitimacy. And until he knew who, he could trust no one. He found Serafina in the sitting room, staring out the window at the Capitol below. When he told her about the forged documents, she turned to face him with eyes full of anger and determination. We fight this, she said immediately. We expose the forgery and prove my father is lying. It will be my word against manufactured evidence, Lucien said, and right now the court wants to believe the worst about me. They want a reason to bring me down. Then we give them a reason not to. We present our own evidence. We show them the truth about my father's debts and his attempts to exploit my position. We make him the villain instead of you. Lucian looked at her and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen for so long he had forgotten it could still feel. She was fighting for him, defending him against accusations that would ruin lesser men, refusing to abandon him even when survival might dictate distancing herself from the scandal. If this goes badly, he said quietly, you could be implicated. Your reputation will be destroyed alongside mine. I do not care about my reputation. I care about you. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither of them had dared speak aloud before. Lucien crossed the room and kissed her with desperate intensity, pouring everything he could not say into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I will burn this entire kingdom down before I let them take you from me, he said. I know. That is why we will win. Wosag. The royal court was packed when they arrived. Nobles and officials crammed into every available space to witness the confrontation. Lucien kept Serafina close as they walked to the front of the chamber, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed them like a physical presence. The king sat on his throne at the far end, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp with interest. Lord Chancellor Rothwick stood beside the throne, holding a leather folder that Lucien assumed contained the forged documents. Lord Arden stood on the opposite side of the chamber with representatives from houses Blackwood, Merrick, and Dalton, his face flushed with nervous triumph. We are here, the king said, his voice carrying through the chamber, to address allegations regarding the marriage of Duke Lucian Vale to Lady Serafina Arden. Lord Arden has presented evidence suggesting the union was achieved through coercion and threats. Duke Vale disputes these claims. We will hear testimony from all parties and examine the evidence before reaching a conclusion. Rothwick stepped forward and began reading from the documents, describing letters allegedly written by Lucien that threatened Lord Arden's family with ruin if he did not agree to the marriage. The threats were specific and vicious, exactly the kind of language people would expect from the brutal Duke of Ravengard. It was masterful forgery, and Lucien could see the court's opinion shifting with each word. When Rothwick finished, the king turned to Lucy. What is your response to these accusations, Your Grace? The documents are forgeries, Lucien said clearly. I never wrote those letters or made those threats. The marriage was a standard political arrangement negotiated through proper channels. Can you prove the documents are false? The king asked. I can prove I never sent them. But proving forgery requires identifying who manufactured the evidence, which is precisely what I am attempting to determine. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The king's expression remained neutral, but Lucian could see the calculation in his eyes. Without proof of forgery, the court would have to decide based on credibility, and right now, public opinion favored the narrative of a desperate father trying to protect his daughter from a tyrant. Lady Seraphina, the king said, turning his attention to her. You have heard these allegations about your marriage. Do you have testimony to offer? Seraphina stepped forward, and Lucien felt pride surge through him at her composure. She looked directly at the king without flinching. Your Majesty, my father is lying. He arranged the marriage to clear gambling debts that threatened to destroy our family. There were no threats from Duke Vale. My father saw an opportunity to solve his financial problems and took it. What happened after the marriage was that my father attempted to continue profiting from my position by spreading lies about imaginary influence and access. When the Duke cut off those opportunities, my father retaliated with these false allegations. That is not true, Lord Arden shouted. I was protecting you from a monster. He forced me to give you up, and now he has poisoned your mind against your own family. You sold me, Seraphina said, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. You did not protect me. You traded me for debt relief and then tried to rent me out piece by piece to anyone who would pay for false promises of ducal favor. The only person who has protected me in this entire situation is my husband. The chamber erupted in conversation, nobles arguing with each other about what to believe. The king raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided. This is a serious matter, the king said. The evidence suggests coercion, but Lady Seraphina's testimony contradicts that narrative. Without additional proof, I cannot make a determination. Your Majesty, a voice called from the crowd, and Lucien turned to see Marcus pushing through the assembled nobles, his face urgent. I have information relevant to these proceedings. The king gestured for him to approach, and Marcus climbed the steps to whisper directly into Rothwick's ear. Lucien watched the Lord Chancellor's expression change from skepticism to shock, and ice flooded his veins. Whatever Marcus had discovered, it was significant enough to alter the entire situation. Rothwick turned to the king, spoke quietly, then addressed the chamber. We have received evidence regarding the origin of the disputed documents. It appears they were forged using materials stolen from Duke Vale's private offices at Ravengard. Relief started to surge through Lucien, but it died immediately when Rothwick continued. The forgery was executed by someone with intimate access to the Duke's seal and signature, someone who knew his habits and routines well enough to create convincing replicas, and the evidence suggests that person was acting on behalf of Lady Seraphina herself. The world seemed to stop. Lucien turned to stare at Seraphina, and he saw his own shock reflected in her face. She was shaking her head, her mouth open in silent denial. That is impossible, Lucien said, his voice rough. She had nothing to do with this. The evidence suggests otherwise, Your Grace, Rothwick said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. We have testimony from servants at Ravengard that Lady Seraphina met secretly with her father before his expulsion, that she provided him with access to your private offices, and that she was seen copying documents from your desk. No, Seraphina breathed. That is not true. I never met with my father. I never took anything from Lucien's office. But Lucien was remembering moments over the past months, small inconsistencies he had dismissed because he trusted her. Times when she had been in his study when he returned unexpectedly. Questions she had asked about his seal and signature. The way she always seemed to know his schedule with uncanny precision. Had she been manipulating him the entire time? Had the connection he felt, the intimacy they had built, been nothing but an elaborate performance designed to gain his trust so she could destroy him from within? This is not true, Seraphina said desperately, reaching for him. Lucien, you know me. You know I would never betray you like this. But did he know her? Really know her? Or had he been so desperate for connection, so hungry for something real, that he had seen what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there? The king was speaking, declaring that the proceedings would be suspended pending further investigation, that both Lord Arden and Lady Seraphina would be held under guard until the truth could be determined. Guards moved forward to take Seraphina into custody, and she fought against them, her eyes locked on Lucien's face. Please, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks.
please believe me. I did not do this. Someone is framing me. Lucien, please.
But Lucien could not speak, could not move, frozen by the sensation of his entire world collapsing around him. He had let her in. He had trusted her. He had allowed himself to care, and this was the result. His father had been right all along. Love was weakness. Attachment was vulnerability. And he had just paid the ultimate price for forgetting those lessons. As the guards dragged Serafina from the chamber, her desperate pleas echoing off the stone walls, Lucien stood motionless and felt every carefully reconstructed piece of his humanity shatter into fragments too small to ever reassemble. The betrayal was complete, and he had no one to blame but himself for believing that someone could actually love the monster he had become. The hours after Serafina's arrest passed in a blur of rage and calculation. Lucien returned to his chambers at the palace and destroyed everything within reach, furniture splintering under his fists, glass shattering against stone walls, years of carefully maintained control evaporating in the face of a betrayal so complete it felt like amputation. His father's voice echoed in his head with vindictive clarity, reminding him that this was always the inevitable conclusion. The caring about anything beyond power was a disease that infected and destroyed from within. But beneath the rage was something else, something that refused to die despite all evidence suggesting it should. Doubt. The way Serafina had looked at him in that courtroom, the genuine terror and desperation in her eyes, did not match the calculated manipulation he was supposed to believe. A woman who had spent months gaining his trust to destroy him would not break character so completely at the moment of triumph. She would maintain the performance, would use his feelings to negotiate her own safety, rather than pleading for him to believe her innocence, unless she actually was innocent. Marcus found him sitting among the wreckage of his chambers as dawnlight filtered through the windows, his knuckles bleeding and his breathing still ragged from exertion. The steward surveyed the destruction without comment, then set down a folder on the one remaining intact table. "The evidence against Lady Serafina," Marcus said quietly. "I retrieved copies before the king's men secured everything." Lucien forced himself to focus, to push past the emotional chaos and examine the situation with the strategic mind that had kept him alive through decades of political warfare. He opened the folder and began reading through testimony from servants, statements about Serafina's movements, timelines of when she allegedly accessed his private offices, and immediately he found inconsistencies. The dates did not align. One servant claimed to have seen Serafina in his study on a day when Lucien knew for certain she had been in the greenhouse with Mrs. Brennan, an event he remembered because he had joined them there unexpectedly. Another statement placed her in meetings with Lord Arden at times when she had been with Lucien himself, conversations he recalled vividly because they had been some of the first real exchanges where she showed him who she actually was beneath the careful Duchess facade. "This is fabricated," Lucien said, his voice rough. "The timelines are impossible. These events could not have happened as described." "I suspected as much, Your Grace. But there is more." Marcus pulled out another document, this one showing financial records. The servants who provided testimony against Lady Serafina all received significant payments within the past month. The money came from accounts traced to House Blackwood. Lucien felt cold fury replace the hot rage from earlier. Lady Margot, the woman he had dismissed from Ravengard, who had resented Serafina from the moment she arrived, who had access to his household and intimate knowledge of his routines. She had orchestrated this entire situation, manufacturing evidence and bribing servants to destroy the woman who replaced her influence. "Where's Lady Margot now?" Lucien demanded. "She departed the capital yesterday, immediately after the court proceedings. Her destination is unknown, but my sources suggest she is heading toward the eastern border. Send riders. I want her found and brought back alive. She will answer for this." Marcus nodded and left to execute the orders, and Lucien sat alone with the evidence of a conspiracy far more sophisticated than he had initially understood. Lord Arden was a convenient figurehead, the desperate father whose allegations provided cover for the real architects of this attack. The noble families were opportunistic participants, seeing a chance to weaken him through scandal. But Lady Margot was the true betrayer, the enemy who had been inside his walls the entire time, watching and planning and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been so focused on external threats that he missed the danger living in his own household. The realization was bitter because it proved his father's lessons in the worst possible way. Trust was vulnerability. Loyalty was illusion. And the only way to maintain power was to assume everyone was a potential enemy until proven otherwise through blood and sacrifice. But Serafina had proven herself through blood and sacrifice. She had defended him in that courtroom when self-preservation would have dictated distancing herself. She had chosen him over her own father, over her family name, over the safety that comes from neutrality. And he had repaid that loyalty by doubting her the instant someone presented manufactured evidence. The shame of that realization cut deeper than any physical wound, because it meant he had become exactly what his father wanted, a man so damaged by paranoia and fear that he could not recognize genuine connection when it stood pleading for him to believe in it. Lucian stood and walked to the window, looking out over the capital as it came alive with morning activity. Somewhere in this city, Serafina was locked in a cell, alone and terrified, believing he had abandoned her to whatever fate the court decided. The image made something twist violently in his chest, a physical pain that reminded him he was still capable of feeling despite decades of training to do the opposite. He had a choice now. He could let the investigation proceed through official channels, trusting that the truth would eventually emerge and vindicate both of them. It was the safe approach, the one that preserved his political position and avoided direct confrontation with the king's authority. Or he could do what every instinct screamed at him to do. He could tear this city apart until he found everyone responsible, could extract confessions through methods the court would never approve, could demonstrate so completely why no one should ever threaten what belonged to him, that the lesson would echo through generations. The second option would cost him everything he had built, his reputation, his political alliances, his standing with the crown. It would transform him from a feared duke into an outlaw, someone who prioritized personal vengeance over institutional legitimacy. It would prove to everyone that he was exactly the monster they always suspected he was beneath the thin veneer of civilization. But it would also prove to Serafina that he believed in her, that he would burn the world down rather than let her face this alone, that the connection between them was real enough to sacrifice everything else for. Men in his position were not supposed to make choices based on love. They were supposed to calculate costs and benefits, to prioritize power and survival over sentiment. His father had drilled that lesson into him with fists and deprivation until it became reflexive, an automatic response that had served him well through countless political battles and personal threats. But his father had also died alone and unmourned, surrounded by wealth and power that meant nothing because there was no one left who cared whether he lived or died. Lucy had attended the funeral and felt nothing, watching them lower a man who had shaped him completely into the ground, and experiencing only relief that the torture was finally over. He did not want to die like that. He did not want to become a cautionary tale about the emptiness of power without connection, about the hollowness of surviving when you have destroyed everything worth living for. So, he made his choice, and once made, he executed it with the ruthless efficiency that had always defined his approach to threats. Lucien called in every favor he had accumulated over decades of careful alliance building. He sent Marcus to gather his most loyal soldiers, men who owed their positions and lives to his protection. He contacted the few nobles who understood that their own power depended on maintaining his, who recognized that if he fell, then the careful balance of the kingdom would collapse into chaos. Within 12 hours, he had assembled a force that existed outside official authority, a private army loyal only to him and willing to operate in the gray spaces where the king's law did not quite reach. It was the kind of coalition that could only be built by someone who understood power in its rawest form, who knew that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, civilization was just organized violence held together by mutually agreed-upon fictions. His first target was Lord Arden. The man was being kept under guard in a townhouse owned by House Dalton, enjoying the protection of nobles who thought they could use him as a weapon against Lucian indefinitely. They were about to learn why that assumption was a fatal miscalculation. Lucien's soldiers surrounded the townhouse in the middle of the night, moving with military precision that spoke to years of training and absolute discipline. They disabled the guards without killing them, a courtesy Lucian extended only because dead bodies would complicate what needed to happen next. When they breached the door, Lord Arden was found cowering in his bedroom, drunk and terrified. Lucien walked into that bedroom alone, closing the door behind him while his soldiers secured the rest of the building. Lord Arden scrambled backward on the bed, his face going pale as he recognized the cold fury in the Duke's expression. "Your Grace, please, I can explain," Lord Arden stammered. "They forced me to make those allegations. The noble families threatened my life if I did not cooperate." "You started this?" Lucian said quietly, his voice more terrifying for its lack of volume. "You spread rumors about your daughter. You attempted to use her position for profit. You created the vulnerability that others exploited. Every consequence that follows flows directly from your choices. I was desperate. The debts, the pressure, I did not know what else to do." Lucien moved closer, and Lord Arden pressed himself against the headboard as if he could somehow escape through the wall. "You sold your daughter, then you tried to rent her out. Then when that failed, you allowed others to frame her for treason. At what point did you consider that maybe, possibly, you should stop destroying the only family you had left? She was just a girl. One girl against everything I stood to lose." The words hung in the air, and Lucien felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This was not a man capable of redemption or growth. This was a parasite who would continue consuming everything around him until someone cut him off permanently. "You are going to write a confession," Lucien said. "You are going to detail every lie you told, every false allegation you made, and you are going to name everyone who helped you. You are going to do this because if you refuse, I will ensure that your death is slow enough that you beg for execution long before it arrives. You cannot threaten me. I am under the king's protection." Lucien smiled, and Lord Arden whimpered at whatever he saw in that expression. "The king's protection extends exactly as far as the king's knowledge. Right now, no one knows where you are except me and my soldiers. If I decide you simply disappeared, there is no investigation, no trial, no consequences. There is just silence where you used to be." It was a bluff, mostly. Lucien would not actually murder Lord Arden in cold blood, because that would make him exactly the monster everyone feared and destroy any remaining moral ground he stood on. But Lord Arden did not need to know that. He just needed to believe he was facing someone capable of following through on the threat. "I will write the confession," Lord Arden whispered. "Just let me live. You will write it now. Marcus will witness and seal it, and then you will remain here under guard until I have secured my wife's freedom. If you attempt to recant or warn your co-conspirators, the confession becomes public, and you face charges of treason that carry a death sentence. Do you understand?" Lord Arden nodded frantically, and Lucien gestured for Marcus to enter with writing materials. He watched Lord Arden's shaking hand scrawl out the confession, detailing how Lady Margot had approached him with a plan to destroy Lucien through manufactured evidence, how the noble families had provided resources and protection in exchange for his cooperation, how Seraphina had been completely innocent, and he had allowed her to be framed anyway. When it was finished and sealed, Lucien left the townhouse without another word to the man who had sold his daughter twice. There would be time for punishment later, after Seraphina was safe, after this entire conspiracy had been burned to ashes. His next target was House Blackwood itself, Motel. Lady Margot had been careless. She assumed that once Seraphina was arrested and Lucien was dealing with the scandal, she would be safe in her escape. That attention would remain focused on the court proceedings while she disappeared into obscurity with her revenge complete. She did not account for Lucien's capacity for focused brutality when someone he cared about was threatened. His soldiers found her 3 days after she left the capital, holed up in a manor house owned by her late husband's family in the Eastern Territories. She had paid for protection from the local garrison, assuming that Lucien would respect jurisdictional boundaries and work through official channels to pursue her. She was wrong. Lucien's force hit the manor house at dawn, overwhelming the local guards before they fully understood what was happening. The garrison commander attempted to invoke his authority, to declare that this was an illegal action beyond Lucien's jurisdiction. Lucien responded by having his soldiers disarm every guard in the compound and confine them to the barracks while he dealt with Lady Margot personally. He found her in the main hall, dressed for travel, her face a mask of defiant rage. She had known this confrontation was inevitable, but had hoped it would happen in a courtroom where she had some protection. Instead, she faced the Duke alone in a room full of his armed soldiers with no witnesses, except people who owed their loyalty to him. "You have no right to be here," Lady Margot said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is outside your territory, outside your authority. The king will hear about this." "The king will hear about many things," Lucien said quietly. including your conspiracy to frame an innocent woman for treason using forged documents and bribed testimony, including your coordination with rival noble families to undermine ducal authority, including your betrayal of a household that provided you shelter and position for years. I did what was necessary. That girl had no business being Duchess of Ravengard. She was common, unworthy, a piece of merchandise sold by a desperate father. I was maintaining the dignity of your position. Lucien moved closer, and Lady Margot took an involuntary step backward. You were jealous. You had grown comfortable with your influence over my household, and her arrival threatened that comfort. So you decided to destroy her rather than adapt to changed circumstances. She was weak. She made you weak. I watched you transform from a force no one dared oppose into a man distracted by a pretty face and empty promises of connection. You needed to be reminded of what actual strength looks like. The twisted logic was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. Lady Margot genuinely believed she had been acting in Lucien's best interest, that destroying Serafina was somehow protective rather than vindictive. She had convinced herself that her actions were justified, that betrayal in service of some imagined greater good was noble rather than treasonous. Did you consider, Lucien said, his voice dropping to something dangerous, that maybe strength looks different than what my father taught me? That maybe the courage to care about someone despite the risk is actually harder than the cowardice of staying emotionally isolated? That is weakness talking. Your father understood power. He would be ashamed of what you have become. My father was a brutal tyrant who died alone and unmourned. If he would be ashamed of me choosing connection over his version of strength, then I consider that the highest compliment. Lucien gestured to his soldiers. Take her to the carriage. She is coming back to the capital to face formal charges. And search this manor thoroughly. I want every document, every piece of correspondence, every scrap of evidence about her conspiracy with the noble families. As the soldiers moved to execute his orders, Lady Margot's composure finally cracked. You are making a mistake. The families supporting me are powerful. They will destroy you for this. Your Duchess will die in a cell, and you will lose everything trying to save her. Then I will lose everything, Lucien said. But at least I will lose it fighting for something real rather than dying slowly while clutching power that means nothing. He left her screaming threats and turned to Marcus, who had been cataloging evidence with methodical efficiency. How bad is the conspiracy? Extensive, Your Grace. Lady Margot coordinated with all three houses. They planned to use the scandal to force the king to strip you of your title and redistribute your lands. Lady Serafina's arrest was just the opening move. They intended to escalate until you were completely destroyed. Lucien absorbed this information with grim acceptance. He had known his ruthless approach to governance made enemies, had understood that powerful families would eventually coordinate against him. But he had always assumed the attack would be military or economic, something he could counter with force. He had not anticipated they would strike at him through Serafina, that they would understand before he did that she had become his vulnerability. The realization was instructive in a brutal way. Power alone was not enough. He needed to protect what made life worth having, even if doing so required dismantling the careful political structures he had spent decades building. We return to the capital, Lucien said. We present this evidence to the king, and we force the release of my wife. And if the king refuses, then we take her by force and deal with the consequences after. Marcus's expression was carefully neutral. That would be treason, Your Grace. The king would have no choice but to declare you an outlaw and strip your titles. Everything you have built would be forfeit. I know. Prepare the men anyway. Untouched. The journey back to the capital took 2 days of hard riding, and Lucien used the time to finalize his plans for multiple scenarios. If the king accepted the evidence and released Serafina, then the conspiracy could be handled through official channels and his position might be salvageable. If the king refused or demanded additional investigation, then Lucien would have to make the choice between waiting for justice and taking direct action. He knew which choice he would make, had known since the moment he decided to pursue Lady Margot outside legal boundaries. Some lines, once crossed, defined everything that came after. He had crossed into territory where institutional legitimacy mattered less than personal conviction, where the rules of civilized society bent under the weight of what he was willing to risk. Men who found themselves in this position usually did so because they had nothing left to lose. But Lucien had everything to lose. which made his willingness to gamble it all away even more significant. He was choosing Serafina over power, love over control, connection over the safety of emotional isolation. His father would have called it weakness. Lucien called it the first truly strong decision he had made in his entire life. They arrived at the capital as the sun set, painting the city in shades of blood and gold. Lucien sent word to Lord Chancellor Rothwick requesting an immediate emergency audience with the king, citing new evidence in the case against Lady Serafina. Rothwick responded within the hour, granting the audience but warning that the king was growing impatient with the scandal and might make a final ruling regardless of new information. That night, Lucien prepared himself for confrontation the way a soldier prepares for battle. He reviewed the evidence until he could recite every detail from memory. He made contingency plans for how his soldiers would breach the prison if necessary. He wrote letters to his remaining allies explaining his actions and releasing them from any obligation to support him if things went badly. And he thought about Serafina, locked somewhere in the palace dungeons, believing she had been abandoned by the one person she thought would protect her. The image was physically painful, a constant ache in his chest that reminded him how completely his life had changed since the day she walked into Ravengard Manor as a piece of merchandise sold by a desperate father. She had transformed him from a monster into something approaching human, had shown him that vulnerability was not weakness, but a different kind of courage, had proven that connection was worth fighting for, even when fighting meant risking everything. He would not abandon her now, would not let her face this alone, would demonstrate through action that the promises he made in her chambers that night were real and binding and worth more than all the power in the kingdom. The audience with the king was scheduled for dawn. Lucien did not sleep, spending the night making final preparations and steeling himself for what might be his last act as Duke of Ravengard. When the first light broke over the capital, he dressed in his formal attire and walked to the palace surrounded by his personal guard. The throne room was already packed with nobles and officials, all gathered to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had dominated court gossip for weeks. The king sat on his throne looking tired and irritated, clearly ready to make a final decision and move on to less complicated matters. Lord Chancellor Rothwick stood beside him, and Lucien saw a calculation in the man's eyes as he approached. "Your Grace," the king said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber, "you requested this audience claiming new evidence. I hope for your sake that it is substantial. I am inclined to conclude these proceedings today regardless of what you present." Lucien bowed formally, then straightened and met the king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty, I have evidence that proves Lady Serafina is innocent of all charges and identifies the true architects of the conspiracy against my household." He presented Lord Arden's confession first, watching the king's expression shift from skepticism to interest as he read the detailed account of manipulation and manufactured evidence. Then he presented the document seized from Lady Margot's manor, showing clear coordination between her and 3 noble houses to destroy him through scandal. "These families conspired to frame my wife for treason as part of a larger plan to strip me of my title and redistribute my lands," Lucien said clearly. "Lady Serafina was an innocent target used to attack me. She had no involvement in any forgery or conspiracy. She is a victim, not a perpetrator." The king read through everything with increasing displeasure, then turned to Lord Chancellor Rothwick. "This evidence appears compelling. Why was I not informed about Lady Margot's involvement earlier?" "We did not have proof of her role until Duke Vale pursued his independent investigation, Your Majesty," Rothwick said carefully. "The noble families covered their tracks well." "Independent investigation," the king repeated, and there was warning in his tone. "You mean Duke Vale operated outside official channels, pursuing suspects beyond his jurisdiction and extracting confessions through methods I doubt would satisfy legal scrutiny?" Lucien met the king's gaze without flinching. "I did what was necessary to protect my wife and uncover the truth. If those actions violated protocol, I accept responsibility. But Lady Serafina should not remain imprisoned for crimes she did not commit while we debate the legality of how her innocence was proven." The king was silent for a long moment, and Lucien could feel the entire chamber holding its breath. This was the moment where everything would be decided, where the king would either recognize the validity of his evidence or punish him for overstepping boundaries, regardless of whether doing so exposed the truth. "Lady Serafina will be released immediately," the king said finally, and relief flooded through Lucien with such force he almost staggered. The charges against her are dropped. Lord Arden will face trial for conspiracy and fraud. Lady Margot will face similar charges, and the 3 noble houses involved will be investigated thoroughly. Thank you, Your Majesty, Lucien said, his voice rough. Do not thank me yet, Duke Vale. You may have uncovered a genuine conspiracy, but your methods were reckless and outside the bounds of acceptable conduct for someone of your position. You will face censure from the Royal Council, and your actions will be reviewed to determine if any additional consequences are warranted. It was a compromise. The king was acknowledging his evidence while maintaining institutional authority by threatening punishment for how it was obtained. Lucien could accept that. He would face whatever censure was deemed appropriate as long as Serafina was free and safe. I understand, Your Majesty. I await the council's decision. The king gestured to his guards. Bring Lady Serafina from the dungeons. This audience is concluded. Lucien stood in that throne room surrounded by nobles who had wanted to see him fall, and he felt none of the triumph he expected. He felt only desperate need to see Serafina, to confirm she was actually safe, to prove through presence what he had failed to prove through trust when she needed it most. The wait was torture. Minutes stretched like hours while guards were dispatched, and the chamber slowly emptied of spectators. Marcus appeared at his side, his expression carefully neutral. You gambled everything, Your Grace, and you won. I have not won anything yet, Lucien said quietly, not until she forgives me for doubting her. Finally, the doors opened and Serafina entered flanked by 2 guards. She looked exhausted and fragile, her expensive dress rumpled from days of imprisonment, her face pale and drawn. But when her eyes found Lucien's across the chamber, something sparked there that made his chest tighten with relief and longing. The guards released her, and she walked toward him slowly, as if afraid he might disappear if she moved too quickly. Lucien closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel her heartbeat against his chest. I am sorry, he said roughly, the words muffled against her hair. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I let them take you. I'm sorry for every second you spent in that cell believing I had abandoned you. Serafina was crying, her body shaking with sobs that she had clearly been suppressing for days. You came for me. You actually came for me. I will always come for you. I will burn this entire kingdom down before I let anyone hurt you again. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the empty throne room while guards watched with carefully averted eyes. When Serafina finally pulled back enough to look at him, Lucien saw something in her expression that made everything he had risked worth it. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we go home to Ravengard. We rebuild. We deal with whatever consequences come from my actions, and we do it together. Together, Serafina repeated, and smiled despite the tears still streaming down her face. But Lucien saw Marcus's expression over her shoulder, saw the warning there that suggested consequences were arriving faster than expected. He turned to find Lord Chancellor Rothwick, approaching with a contingent of royal guards, their faces grim. Duke Vale, I'm sorry, Rothwick said. But the king has reconsidered. There are reports of armed soldiers loyal to you occupying territory outside your jurisdiction, of threats made against noble families, of actions that cannot be ignored regardless of your motivations. You are ordered to stand down and surrender your forces immediately, or face charges of treason and armed insurrection. The room went cold. Lucien felt Serafina tense in his arms, felt the weight of his choices pressing down with suffocating force. He had won her freedom, but the cost was his own. The king was giving him an ultimatum: submit to punishment for his methods or face total destruction as an enemy of the crown. And somewhere in the city, his soldiers waited for his command, ready to fight if he gave the word, ready to transform this political conflict into open warfare that would tear the kingdom apart and cost countless lives. Lucien looked at Serafina, at the fear and determination warring in her eyes, at the woman who had become more important than power or safety or the careful life he had built. And he made his choice. No, he said quietly. The word echoed through the throne room like a gunshot, and Rothwick's face went pale. Your Grace, you must understand what refusing this order means. You will be declared an outlaw, your titles will be stripped, your lands will be forfeit, and you will be hunted as a traitor to the crown. I understand completely, Lucien said, But I will not surrender my soldiers or submit to punishment for protecting my wife from a conspiracy that your own investigation failed to uncover. If that makes me a traitor, so be it. Serafina grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. Lucien, you cannot do this. You will lose everything. I already lost everything once when I let them take you, he said, looking down at her. I will not make that mistake again. The guards moved forward, hands on their weapons, and Lucien's own soldiers responded by forming a protective barrier around him and Serafina. The tension in the room became suffocating, violence hanging in the air like a storm about to break. This was the moment where everything would change, where the careful balance of power would shatter beyond repair, where a man who had built an empire on ruthless control would either submit to authority he no longer recognized or declare war on a kingdom that could not tolerate his defiance. Lucien pulled Serafina closer and prepared to give the order that would start a battle neither side could afford, but both were now committed to fighting. The throne room held its breath. Lucien's soldiers stood ready, their hands on weapons, their loyalty to him absolute despite the fact that following his orders now meant becoming enemies of the crown. Rothwick's royal guards mirrored their tension, caught between duty to the king and the practical reality that engaging Lucien's forces would turn the palace into a battlefield with consequences no one could predict or control. Serafina's fingers dug into Lucien's arm with desperate strength. He could feel her trembling against him, could sense the war happening inside her between the relief of freedom and the horror of watching him throw everything away to keep her safe. She had not asked for this sacrifice. She had not wanted to be the reason he destroyed himself. But here they stood at the precipice of violence that would reshape the kingdom, and all of it traced back to a marriage that began as nothing more than a transaction between desperate people. Power had always been Lucien's answer to every threat, the only language he spoke fluently, the foundation upon which he built his entire existence. But power was also a trap that locked you into patterns of domination and control until you forgot there might be other ways to solve problems that did not require breaking everything in your path. His father had understood power. His father had wielded it with brutal efficiency. And his father had died alone in a fortress that became his prison, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing because there was no one left who cared whether he lived or died. Lucien had spent his whole life trying not to become his father, while simultaneously following every lesson the man had beaten into him. The contradiction had carved itself so deep into his bones that he could not separate which parts of himself were genuine and which were just survival instincts masquerading as personality. But standing here with Serafina in his arms and violence hanging in the air like a promise, he finally understood the fundamental difference between them. His father would have given the order to fight, would have seen submission as weakness and chosen destruction over compromise, would have believed that maintaining power at any cost was more important than preserving what made life worth living in the first place. Lucien was not his father, and maybe that meant he could choose differently. He took a slow breath and felt Serafina's heartbeat against his chest, rapid and terrified but steady beneath the fear. She had chosen him over her family, over safety, over every rational calculation that should have made her distance herself from the scandal surrounding him. She had stood in that courtroom and defended him when doing so offered no benefit except the satisfaction of speaking truth. She had shown him what loyalty actually looked like when it was not purchased through fear or intimidation, but freely given despite all the reasons not to give it. He would not repay that loyalty by starting a war that would consume her along with everything else. Lucien looked at Rothwick and saw the Lord Chancellor's tension, the way the older man was preparing himself for violence while simultaneously hoping it would not come. Rothwick was a survivor, someone who had outlasted multiple monarchs by understanding when to push and when to retreat, when to enforce authority and when to allow strategic flexibility. He did not want this fight any more than Lucien did. He was following orders while privately calculating whether those orders would destroy more than they preserved. Lord Chancellor, Lucien said quietly, and the entire room seemed to lean forward to hear him. I will not surrender my soldiers, but I will accompany you to the king and negotiate terms for how this situation can be resolved without bloodshed. Rothwick's expression flickered with surprise and carefully concealed relief. The king was clear in his orders, Your Grace. There is no room for negotiation. Then the king will have war in his capital and a fractured kingdom, because I will not submit to punishment for protecting my wife from a conspiracy your investigation failed to uncover. If that is unacceptable, Then we fight here and now, and let the consequences fall where they will. It was a gambit, offering negotiation while simultaneously making clear that he would not back down from his core position. Lucien was betting that the king valued stability more than his pride, that the threat of actual violence would create space for compromise that did not exist when everyone was posturing from positions of absolute authority. Serafina's voice was barely a whisper. "Lucien, what are you doing?" "I am trying to find a way through this that does not require burning the kingdom down," he said, not taking his eyes off Rothwick. "I am trying to be something other than the monster everyone expects me to be." Rothwick studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will convey your position to the king, but you must understand that any negotiation will require concessions from you, your grace. The crown cannot appear weak or uncertain in the face of defiance." "I understand, but my wife's freedom is not negotiable, and I will not be punished for uncovering a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the realm. Those are my lines. Everything else can be discussed." The Lord Chancellor gestured to his guards to stand down, and the tension in the room decreased fractionally. "Wait here. I will return with the king's response." As Rothwick departed, Lucien felt his soldiers relax slightly, their hands moving away from weapons, even as they maintained their protective formation. Marcus appeared at his side, his expression a mixture of concern and something that might have been pride. "That was either brilliant or suicidal, your grace. Possibly both. It was necessary. We cannot win a war against the crown. We can only negotiate from a position strong enough that the king decides compromise is preferable to conflict. And if the king refuses, if he sees this as weakness rather than strategic positioning?" Lucien looked at Serafina, at the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope warring in her expression, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless his entire life. "Then we take her, and we leave. We abandon Ravengard, abandon my title, abandon everything except each other. And we build something new somewhere that values what we have become more than what we used to be." He said it knowing that abandoning his position would feel like death, like cutting away parts of himself that had defined his identity for decades. Power had been his purpose, control had been his method, and fear had been his currency. Walking away from all of that would mean confronting who he actually was beneath the armor he had worn for so long that it felt like skin. But maybe that confrontation was necessary. Maybe learning to live without power was the only way to discover whether he had anything real underneath, whether the connection he felt with Serafina was genuine or just another transaction dressed up in romantic language to make it more palatable. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Lucien held Serafina and listened to her breathing gradually calm, felt her lean into him with trust that still felt undeserved after how completely he had failed her when she needed his faith most. She should hate him for doubting her, should resent being used as a weapon against him by people who understood his attachments better than he did. Instead, she stood with him at the edge of destruction and offered her presence as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "I do not deserve you," he said quietly. Serafina pulled back enough to look at his face, her eyes red from crying but fierce with determination. "You came for me. You risked everything to prove my innocence. You chose me over power. That is not something an undeserving man does. I doubted you when you needed me to believe in you. I let them take you because I was too damaged to recognize genuine loyalty when it stood pleading for me to trust it. You are human. Humans make mistakes when they are terrified of being betrayed. I do not blame you for that. You should. Maybe. But I do not. Because I understand what your father did to you, what survival cost you, and I know that choosing to trust me despite that history is harder for you than it would be for anyone else." Lucien felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had maintained for so long that its collapse was both devastating and liberating. "I love you," he said, and the words felt like confession and surrender and victory all at once. "I love you more than I love power or control or the carefully constructed life I spent decades building. And that terrifies me because love is the one thing I was never supposed to feel." Serafina smiled through fresh tears. "I love you too, even though you are impossible and brutal and terrifying when you want to be. I love you because beneath all of that is someone who actually cares enough to fight for what matters." They kissed there in the throne room, with guards watching and violence still hanging in the air like a storm that might yet break. It was not the desperate passion from before, but something deeper and more permanent, a promise sealed in front of witnesses that whatever came next they would face together. When Rothwick returned, he was alone, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that suggested complicated news. "The king has considered your position, Duke Vale. He is willing to negotiate, but there are conditions." "What conditions?" "You will publicly apologize for operating outside legal authority in your pursuit of evidence. You will accept a formal censure from the Royal Council. You will pay substantial fines to compensate for the disruption your actions caused. And you will submit to increased oversight of your activities for the next 5 years to ensure compliance with Crown authority." Lucien absorbed these terms with grim acceptance. They were designed to humiliate while preserving his essential power, to demonstrate Crown authority without destroying him completely. It was a compromise that allowed both sides to claim partial victory while avoiding the catastrophic consequences of actual conflict. "And in exchange?" he asked. "In exchange, Lady Seraphina's freedom is guaranteed. The charges against her are permanently dismissed. The noble families involved in the conspiracy will face prosecution. Your title and lands remain intact, and this matter is considered closed pending your compliance with the stated conditions." It was better than Lucien had hoped for, and worse than he wanted. Public apology felt like swallowing glass. Accepting censure meant acknowledging he had overstepped boundaries, and oversight suggested the king no longer fully trusted him to govern his territories without supervision. But Seraphina would be safe. The people who had conspired against them would face consequences, and he would retain enough power to protect what mattered, even if he had to operate under constraints that had not existed before. "I accept the terms," Lucien said. Rothwick nodded, then gestured toward the throne room doors. "The king will see you both now. The formal agreement will be documented and witnessed." As they walked through the palace halls toward the throne room, Seraphina leaned close and whispered, "You hate this. I can feel how much you hate submitting to these conditions." "I do hate it, but I hate the alternative more. And maybe that is growth. Maybe learning to compromise when compromise serves the greater good is part of becoming something better than what my father created. Or maybe it is just pragmatism. Maybe pragmatism and growth are not mutually exclusive." The king was waiting on his throne, looking tired and irritated but less hostile than Lucien had feared. The formal agreement was read aloud, each condition articulated with legal precision, each concession detailed so there could be no future dispute about terms. Lucien listened and felt each word like a small cut, death by 1,000 compromises to pride and autonomy. But he also felt Seraphina's hand in his, warm and solid and real in a way that power had never been. And he understood with sudden clarity that his father had been wrong about everything that mattered. Strength was not domination. Power was not control. Survival was not the same as living. And the willingness to compromise when something truly important was at stake was not weakness, but the hardest form of courage. When the reading concluded, Lucien stepped forward and delivered the required public apology with as much dignity as he could manage, while essentially admitting that he had valued his wife's safety more than legal procedure. The assembled nobles listened with barely concealed satisfaction, pleased to see the brutal Duke of Ravengard humbled, even if the humbling was more symbolic than substantive. The king accepted his apology with formal courtesy, then spoke directly to Seraphina. "Lady Seraphina, you have been cleared of all charges, and your reputation is restored. The crown apologizes for the ordeal you endured as a result of this conspiracy. You are free to return to Ravengard with your husband." Seraphina curtsied, her voice steady. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I am grateful for your justice." As they left the throne room, Lucien felt Marcus fall into step beside them, the steward's expression carefully neutral. "The men are asking what happens next, Your Grace. Should they prepare to return to Ravengard?" "Yes, we leave tomorrow. I am done with this city and its politics." "And the noble families? The ones who conspired against you? They will face royal prosecution. I am no longer involved in that process. The king wants to demonstrate that justice flows through official channels rather than private vengeance. Let him have his demonstration." Marcus nodded, but Lucien could see the unasked questions in his eyes. The steward was wondering whether his duke had been broken by this experience, whether the compromise had cost him something essential that could never be recovered. Lucien did not have answers yet. He just knew that he felt different, lighter somehow, despite the humiliation and constraints, as if shedding the need to appear invulnerable had freed up space for something more authentic. They spent one more night in the capital, making final arrangements for departure and allowing Serafina to rest properly for the first time in days. Lucienne sat with her in their chambers and watched her sleep, studying the way exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes, the way she curled into herself even in sleep, as if still protecting against threats that might emerge from the darkness. He had almost lost her, had come within hours of watching her be convicted based on manufactured evidence, while he stood paralyzed by doubt and damaged instincts. The memory would haunt him for years, would reshape how he approached trust and vulnerability, and the constant calculation of whether caring about something gave it power to destroy you. His father's lessons had prepared him for every threat except the one that mattered most. They had taught him to survive betrayal by never allowing himself to be vulnerable to it in the first place. But that approach also meant never experiencing genuine connection, never knowing what it felt like to have someone choose you, not because they feared you or needed you, but because they simply wanted you despite all the broken parts. Serafina stirred and opened her eyes, blinking away sleep as she focused on him. "You are watching me again. I am memorizing you, in case I forget what real looks like when we go back to Ravengard and I have to be the Duke again. You are the Duke whether you want to be or not, but maybe you can be a different version. Maybe you can be the man who chose love over power when it mattered most. That man almost got us both killed. That man started a political war that required the king to impose oversight and restrictions. That man humiliated himself in front of the entire court. That man saved me," Serafina said quietly. "That man proved that beneath all the brutal efficiency and calculated violence is someone capable of sacrifice for something other than strategic advantage. Do not diminish that because it cost you pride." Lucian moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hand and studying her fingers like they contained answers to questions he did not know how to ask. "I do not know how to be both. I do not know how to maintain power while also being the person you deserve. Maybe you do not need to maintain power the same way anymore. Maybe there are other approaches that do not require everyone to fear you. Fear is effective. Fear keeps people from testing boundaries and challenging authority. Fear also isolates. Fear means you can never know if anyone's loyalty is genuine or just survival instinct. Would you rather be feared or trusted?" It should have been an easy question. His entire life had been built around being feared, around maintaining such absolute dominance that no one dared oppose him. But sitting here with Serafina's hand in his, exhausted from fighting battles that should never have been necessary, Lucian found himself wanting something different. "I want to be trusted by the people who matter, and feared by the ones who threaten them," he said finally. "I want to be able to distinguish between the two categories before I destroy everyone equally." Serafina smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "That seems like a reasonable goal. Difficult, but reasonable." "Everything worth having is difficult. You taught me that. I did not teach you anything. I just reminded you of parts that were already there beneath all the armor your father forced you to wear." They sat like that for a long time, two damaged people who had found each other through desperation and circumstance and somehow built something real from the wreckage of their separate traumas. Tomorrow they would return to Ravengard and begin the process of rebuilding not just their household, but themselves, learning how to live with the changes this ordeal had carved into both of them. But tonight they simply held each other and breathed and existed in the quiet space between who they had been and who they were becoming. The journey back to Ravengard took 5 days because Lucian refused to push the pace, wanting Serafina to recover fully before facing the responsibilities waiting at home. They traveled slowly through territories he had governed with iron control, and he found himself seeing them differently now, noticing details that had been invisible when he was focused only on maintaining dominance. The villages they passed were prosperous but fearful, their people offering formal respect without warmth or genuine connection. They obeyed his authority because they had no choice, not because they believed in anything he represented beyond raw power. It was effective governance in the sense that order was maintained and rebellions were non-existent. But it was also hollow, a kingdom built on foundations that would crumble the moment he showed any real weakness. Serafina noticed his observations and seemed to understand the internal struggle playing out behind his carefully controlled expression. "You are questioning everything you built. I am wondering whether I built anything real or just constructed an elaborate prison that I convinced myself was a fortress. Those are not mutually exclusive. Something can be both protective and confining. My father believed that fear was the only reliable foundation for power. He said people were fundamentally selfish and would betray you the moment they saw advantage in doing so. So the solution was to make betrayal so dangerous that no one dared attempt it. And now you are wondering if he was wrong. I am wondering if he was damaged rather than wise. If his brutality was not strength, but the desperate defense mechanism of someone who could not survive any other way. Serafina was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape roll past their carriage window. My mother used to say that hurt people, that cruelty is almost always the result of someone passing along their own trauma because they do not know how to process it differently. Maybe your father was not evil. Maybe he was just broken and trying to make sure you were strong enough to survive a world that broke him. That does not excuse what he did. No, but understanding does not require excusing. You can acknowledge the damage while also recognizing that he probably thought he was protecting you in the only way he knew how. Lucian felt something shift in his chest, some knot of rage and resentment loosening fractionally at the suggestion that his father had been acting from fear rather than malice. It did not erase the years of brutality or the lessons beaten into him with such thoroughness that they became reflexive. But it did create space for something other than pure hatred, some recognition that his father had been as much a victim of circumstance as an architect of trauma. I do not want to become him, Lucian said quietly. I do not want to die alone in a fortress that became my prison, surrounded by power that means nothing because there is no one left who cares. Then do not. Choose differently. Build something that matters more than dominance. I do not know if I can. Fear and control are all I know. They are the tools I have mastered. So learn new tools. You are capable of more than you think. You proved that when you chose me over everything else. As they crested the final hill and Ravengard Manor came into view, Lucian felt both relief and trepidation. This place was his foundation, the seat of power he had transformed from minor northern duchy into something the king himself respected and feared. But it was also the monument to every lesson his father had taught. Every brutal decision he had made in service of maintaining control. Coming back meant deciding what to keep and what to discard, which parts of himself were essential and which were just scar tissue masquerading as personality. It meant facing the people who served him out of fear and determining whether any of that loyalty could transform into something more genuine. It meant learning how to govern differently while still maintaining enough strength that threats understood he was not weak, just changed. The servants gathered to greet them, lined up with military precision, their faces carefully neutral. Mrs. Brennan stepped forward, her severe expression softening fractionally when she saw Serafina. "Welcome home, your graces. We have prepared everything for your return." Serafina smiled and embraced the older woman, a gesture that clearly surprised Mrs. Brennan, but which she returned after a moment's hesitation. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. It is good to be home." Lucian watched this exchange and saw the beginnings of what Serafina had been describing. Connection that was not based on fear or hierarchy, but on genuine regard between people who shared space and responsibility. It was small, almost insignificant in the context of governing an entire duchy, but it was also the foundation upon which different approaches could be built. Over the following weeks, Lucian began implementing changes with the same systematic efficiency he had always applied to problems requiring solutions. He met with village leaders and listened to concerns that had previously been dismissed or ignored. He reduced some of the more draconian enforcement policies that had maintained order through intimidation rather than justice. He promoted competent people based on ability rather than their willingness to execute brutal orders without question. The changes were subtle, incremental adjustments rather than revolutionary overhaul. But they accumulated, shifting the atmosphere of Ravengard from oppressive fortress to something that retained strength while allowing space for humanity. Some of his advisors resisted, warning that softness would be interpreted as weakness and invite challenges to his authority. Lucian acknowledged their concerns while continuing the changes anyway, betting that sustainable power required genuine loyalty rather than just fear. Serafina watched these transformations with quiet pride, supporting him while also carving out her own role beyond just being his duchess. She established programs to support families struggling with debt, remembering her own father's desperation and wanting to create alternatives to the kind of exploitation that had defined her early life. She worked with Mrs. Brennan to improve conditions for household staff, ensuring they were treated with dignity rather than just as extensions of his will. Together, they began reshaping Ravengard into something neither of them had experienced before. Not a perfect kingdom free of conflict or difficulty, but a place where power served purpose beyond its own perpetuation, where strength protected rather than just dominated. What? 6 months after their return, Lucien stood in his study reviewing reports when Marcus entered with news about the conspiracy's final resolution. Lord Arden had been convicted of fraud and conspiracy, sentenced to 15 years in a debtor's prison where he would spend his remaining days paying for crimes that had almost destroyed his own daughter. Lady Margot faced similar charges and had been stripped of her title and lands, relegated to obscurity that would last until her death. The three noble houses had fared differently. House Merrick and House Dalton had negotiated plea agreements that involved massive fines and loss of privileges but preserved their basic positions. House Blackwood had refused to cooperate and been dismantled completely, its lands redistributed and its name effectively erased from positions of influence. Justice of a sort, Marcus observed, though slower and messier than your old approach would have been. My old approach would have involved executions and confiscated property distributed as warnings to anyone considering similar actions, Lucien said. This outcome is more complicated but probably more effective long-term. The noble families see that conspiracy has consequences while also recognizing that cooperation and submission receive some mercy. You have changed, Your Grace. 6 months ago, you would have pushed for maximum punishment regardless of strategic considerations. 6 months ago, I believed that fear was the only reliable currency. Now I understand that it is just one tool among many, and overusing it makes you predictable. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. The oversight from the Crown ends in 4 years. There is speculation about whether you will return to your previous methods once that restriction is lifted. Lucien considered this, recognizing the test embedded in the question. People were watching to see whether his changes were genuine transformation or just strategic adaptation to temporary constraints. I will not return to exactly what I was before, but I will also not become something soft and easily dismissed. The goal is finding balance between strength and humanity, between protecting what matters and destroying everything that poses even theoretical threats. That seems impossibly difficult. Everything worth having is impossibly difficult. But for the first time in my life, I actually want to attempt it rather than just calculating whether the cost is acceptable. Later that evening, Lucien found Serafina in the library, her favorite refuge in the castle. She looked up from her book and smiled, and he felt the now familiar warmth that accompanied her presence, the sense that despite everything broken in him, there was at least one person who saw past the damage to whatever remained underneath. The conspiracy cases are resolved, he said, sitting beside her. Your father will spend the rest of his life in prison. Serafina's expression flickered with something complicated, pain and relief and resignation all mixed together. I should feel something more than I do. He is still my father. He forfeited that relationship when he sold you and then tried to destroy you for his own benefit. You're allowed to feel however you feel without guilt. I feel mostly sad. Sad that he could not be better, that he chose his pride and greed over everything else, that he will die alone having burned every bridge and betrayed everyone who tried to help him. That was his choice. You are not responsible for it. I know, but it still hurts to watch someone destroy themselves so completely. Lucien pulled her close, and they sat like that for a long time. Two people who understood that family could wound as deeply as any enemy, that sometimes the hardest thing was accepting that some people could not be saved, regardless of how much you wanted to rescue them. We are building something different here, Serafina said quietly. Something that does not require destroying ourselves or others to maintain. Are we succeeding? Lucien asked. Or am I deluding myself that change is possible? You are succeeding, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. I see it in how the staff interacts with you now, how the village leaders speak more openly in meetings, how people have started bringing problems to you because they believe you might actually help rather than just punish. It feels fragile, like one serious challenge could shatter everything we have built. Of course it is fragile. Trust is always fragile. But that does not make it less real or less valuable. Lucian thought about his father, alone in his fortress, dying without anyone who mourned him. He thought about the person he had been 6 months ago, brutal and efficient and empty in ways he had not recognized until Serafina showed him what connection could feel like. He thought about the future they were building together, uncertain and difficult, but infinitely more meaningful than anything he had experienced before. "I love you," he said, the words still feeling new despite how often he had said them in recent months. "I love you for showing me that survival and living are not the same thing. I love you for believing I could become something other than what my father created. I love you for staying when leaving would have been easier and safer." Serafina turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with emotion. "I love you because you chose to change when change required admitting you were wrong. I love you because beneath all the brutality you have protected is someone capable of genuine care. I love you because you fight for what matters, even when fighting costs everything." They kissed there in the library surrounded by books and firelight, and Lucien felt something settle in his chest that had been restless and searching his entire life. This was what his father had never understood, what years of brutal training had been designed to prevent him from discovering. Connection was not weakness, but the foundation upon which real strength was built. Vulnerability was not invitation for exploitation, but the courage to risk pain for the possibility of something genuine. The road ahead remained difficult. There would be challenges to their authority, threats that needed handling, moments when old instincts screamed at him to return to brutality because it was easier than maintaining the balance they had created. But for the first time, Lucien believed he could walk that road without becoming the monster his father had been, without sacrificing everything human to maintain power, because he had Serafina, and she had him. And together they were building something real from the wreckage of their separate traumas, proving that even people broken by circumstance could choose to heal rather than passing their damage forward to the next generation. A year after the conspiracy, on the anniversary of the day they had almost lost everything, Lucien stood with Serafina on the walls of Ravengard and looked out over lands that had transformed from prison to home. The kingdom was not perfect. There were still threats and challenges and moments when maintaining power required decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. But it was his in a way it had never been before. Chosen rather than just controlled. Protected out of genuine care rather than just strategic necessity. "What are you thinking?" Serafina asked. "I am thinking that my father was wrong about almost everything that mattered. Fear is not the only foundation for power. Attachment is not weakness. And dying surrounded by people who care is infinitely preferable to dying alone in a fortress that became your prison. Those are good realizations. They cost us everything to learn. And we rebuilt from nothing. That is the part that matters. Not what we lost, but what we created from the rubble." Lucien pulled her close and felt her warmth against him, solid and real in a way that power had never been. "I would do it again. I would risk everything again for this. For you. I know. That is why it worked. Because you were willing to sacrifice what you thought defined you to protect what actually did." They stood like that as the sun set over Ravengard, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Two people who had survived the worst their world could throw at them and emerged not broken, but transformed. The scars remained, would always remain, permanent marks of battles fought and prices paid. But scars were also evidence of survival, proof that they had endured when everything suggested they should not have. The Duke and Duchess of Ravengard had started as a transaction, two desperate people using each other to escape their separate traps. But they had become something far more valuable. Partners who chose each other again every day despite knowing all the broken parts, who built strength from vulnerability and found power in connection. Their story would be told in the kingdom for generations, not as a fairy tale of perfect love conquering all, but as a brutal, honest account of two damaged people who fought through trauma and circumstance to create something real. It would be told as a reminder that change was possible, even for those most broken by their histories, that choosing differently was always an option, even when every instinct screamed otherwise. And years later, when Lucien finally died, he did not die alone in a fortress that had become his prison. He died surrounded by family, mourned by people who genuinely cared, leaving behind a legacy that meant something beyond just accumulated power. He died having learned the hardest lesson, the one his father never understood. Strength was not about domination. It was about the courage to be vulnerable. Power was not about control. It was about choosing what to protect and what to release. And love was not weakness, but the foundation upon which everything meaningful was built. Serafina held his hand as he took his final breaths decades later, and his last thought was not regret for what he had sacrificed, but gratitude for what he had gained. He had lived, truly lived, and that made everything else worthwhile. The fortress of Ravengard stood strong long after its duke was gone, but it stood differently than it had before. It stood as a home rather than a prison, as a monument to transformation rather than just power, as proof that even the most brutal beginnings could lead to something beautiful if people were willing to choose growth over survival. That was their legacy. Not perfection, but honest struggle toward something better. Not fairy tale endings, but real people making hard choices and learning from their mistakes. Not weakness disguised as strength, but actual strength built on the foundation of genuine connection. And in the end, that was enough.